Hello there, and welcome to the second ever Lost Bits Mega-Pak. I'm so excited. It's lovely to see you. I am your host, I am Marie, and what follows are 10 unusual and mysterious tales from our past, including 7 of the most recent episodes uploaded on my channel, and 3 completely brand new episodes that you can't find anywhere else. I hope that you guys enjoy them. I've been so looking forward to sharing them with you all. And if you are a regular viewer on my channel, then first of all, thank you. And second of all, if you want to jump right to the new episodes, then be sure to check the description box because I put timestamps in there for all of our stories today to make it super easy to jump through them all. And so, without further ado, we'll just dive right in. And I'll pop in like this in between the stories to see how you're doing and to talk about the mysteries that we're covering here a little bit more. And our first story is definitely mysterious. We're going to be visiting the Sahara Desert to learn about a time when it wasn't really a desert at all, and the enigmatic ancient people that made this place their home. The Tnari Desert, which extends from the modern countries of Niger into Chad, is part of the larger and much more famous Sahara Desert. And in fact, it's one of the most dangerous and inhospitable places in an already famously dangerous place. Even in relation to the rest of the Sahara, this place has almost no plant life. It's so dry and it's so arid. And July temperatures here can reach as high as 108 degrees Fahrenheit or 42 degrees Celsius. And the vast expanses of sand dunes are also met with long fields of just gravelly plains. And the whole desert too is subjected to strong eastern and northeasterly winds that just tear through here. And altogether it is a really difficult place to imagine anyone living for any amount of time, even with the height of modern technology at one's disposal. But 12,000 years ago, the Tnari Desert, and in fact all of the Sahara, would have been an incredibly different landscape. Due to climatic changes that we'll get into later, this whole area experienced huge amounts of rainfall compared to today, creating what historians have dubbed the Green Sahara. And from one side of Africa to the other, literally from Egypt to Mauritania, this previously parched landscape became filled with shallow lakes and forest and jungle. And accordingly, many different animals started to make their home here too. They found evidence of elephants, giraffes, hartebeests, warthogs, pythons, and many others. And the lakes were full of fish. Nile perch were there, as well as small catfish and others. And actually 12,000 years ago, the Sahara was a beautiful and bountiful region just filled with animal and bird and fish life. And also, of course, people. Across different places in the Sahara, evidence has been found of intrepid humans making their home in this region for thousands and thousands of years. And one of the people that we're going to be getting to know today, the Kiphians, were here well over 10,000 years ago. And looking back at our little spot again, that spot that would one day become that inhospitable Tnari Desert, well, way back when, there was a beautiful lake here, and a beautiful little community. One that would remain undiscovered beneath the sands until the year 2000, when a paleontologist actually was out here looking for dinosaur bones. Instead, he stumbled across an ancient human settlement. But I don't think that term settlement really does this place any justice. Because as the paleontologist and the others that came after him would soon discover, this place was home to not just one, but 2 ancient cultures of the ancient Green Sahara. One you've heard of already, the Kiphians, but also another. And not only that, but though they did not live here, these 2 different cultures, at the same time, the second one at least does seem to have been aware of the earlier presence of the first. And also when you step back and look at the timeline of just how long altogether both of these groups of people were living here. Altogether, people lived in this one little spot for well over 5,000 years. And they didn't find just evidence of their lives either, but also of their deaths. But we'll get into all that, and we'll get into why this site is so fascinating and what we know of these brilliant ancient people. But first, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Lost Bits. My name is Marie. It's lovely to see you. And I'm so excited to share a little bit of the history of you of Gobero and the ancient lost people of the Green Sahara. There's so much to unpack here, and this is going to be our first trip to Africa. I'm so excited. I've been fascinated with people that may have lived in the Sahara ever since I first saw images of some of their beautiful rock art that you might have seen too from time to time. It's just fascinating to imagine people here and how different their world would have been from ours. And I'm so excited to visit a different continent and 2 different groups of people. This will be so much fun, and to get a chance too to learn about such a unique part of our past. This is so wonderful. We need some African bits. Come on. Now, as I said, the landscape of Gobero at this time would have been incredibly different, and where they find the evidence of habitation would have been along the side of an ancient lake. And when the Kiphian people arrived here 10,000 years ago, they would have found everything they needed. They were the first that we know of to have lived in this exact spot. And also it's them that first started burying their dead here. And it's from both of these types of ancient artifacts and remains that we're able to learn a little bit more about these ancient people's lives. The Kiphians seem to be mostly migratory hunter-gatherers, though the migratory part did stop and they did settle down once they got to Gobero. One thing unique about the Kiphians is that they could be quite tall, reaching as high as 6 feet. And from studying their remains too, they've been able to tell that these people had a rich, protein-filled diet and were quite muscular in general. Year-round habitation probably started to occur as it really got into the wet period of the Sahara, around 7,700 BCE. And it's around this time too that we see the first burials from them take place. The bodies we see left from them are tightly bound, suggesting they may have been wrapped, actually as we talked about recently in a Claude Halan episode. And while parts of their funerary practice are still being learned by us today, it's obviously clear they took great care of their dead. These early Kiphian graves are now part of the oldest known cemetery, the cemetery here at Gobero, found anywhere in the Sahara. While the graves of the Kiphians don't often display grave goods as we would think of them, they have recovered other artifacts too that give us more hints at their lifestyle, like barbed harpoons that seem to have been used to catch fish, as well as ceramic and pottery shards. But I'm very sorry to say that a lot of this ancient beautiful culture is still a mystery to us. Because unfortunately around 6,200 BCE, a period of drought hit this region for an incredibly long time, lasting as much as a millennium. At that point, the Kiphians seem to have been forced to leave their home, and there's no sign of them ever being able to return. And the Kiphians as a whole disappear from the archaeological record as a whole around this time too. But eventually, this wasn't, the end of the Green Sahara. The drought kind of moved on, and by that point the Kiphian were gone, but a new culture came in, known as the Tanarians. Now, these Tanarians seem to have been of different biological origin than the Kiphians, though there's still some argument among anthropologists that think they might be a descendant of the Kiphians. Their DNA analysis shows that they came from different regions of the continent. These new people, the Tanarians, seem to have even looked a little bit different than the Kiphians had, being shorter and lighter statured in general. They also had some other differences, and though they did practice hunting and fishing, they were also cattle herders, and they would too start living at Gobero once it got a little more wet again, and they even started using the very same cemetery that the Kiphians had used. But perhaps touchingly, they seem to have taken great care to not disturb the older Kiphian graves in any way. In fact, none of the Kiphian graves were harmed or touched or looted. The later Tanarians seem to have respectfully and carefully kind of worked around them. And while the Kiphian graves had very little by way of grave goods, the Tanarians were the complete opposite, and their graves are some of the most distinctive and unusual and beautiful found anywhere in the ancient world. They often include jewelry and the bodies being left in ritual poses. There's been the body of a young girl recovered, for example, that is wearing an upper arm bracelet carved from a hippo tusk. There was another man who was buried that was seated in a mud turtle's shell. And there is another burial that actually shows a young woman buried with 2 children that are believed to be hers, and they're posed as if reaching towards each other to embrace each other. Not only that, but beneath the bodies and all around them, they found the evidence of large amounts of pollen. They think that the bodies of this woman and her children were literally laid down on a bed of flowers. You can see an image of this here. It's beautiful, even as it's kind of heartbreaking. And it's clear, again, even if they're doing it in a different way, they're showing so much love and care for their dead. And these Tanarian people, would live here themselves for thousands of years, arriving and settling permanently around 5,200 BCE and staying permanently until 2,500 BCE. And even at that point, they didn't leave right away. Because the thing is, that's around the time when that greening of the Sahara starts to go away. And for a long time, scientists debated what caused the Sahara to become a desert. Some even argued it could have been related to the people living there, but now we know it was a little bit different, and actually everything that happened was completely outside of their control. It's since been proven by scientists that this greening of the Sahara is caused by a cyclical wobble, basically, of the Earth's orbit, roughly every 21,000 years. Just due to how the Earth moves in its orbit around the Sun, the position of the Sahara on the planet and its relation to the sun literally changes, so it doesn't get as much direct heat as it normally would, and so you get these periods of temporary greening, but eventually the desert does always come back. And unfortunately, around 5200 BCE, that's exactly what happened. It wouldn't have been right away. And in fact, we know that the people continued living here for quite some time after it would have slowly started to get drier and hotter, and the water and the animals would have slowly started going away. And eventually, even though they would have lived there now for literally millennia, the people would have just had to start moving too. And around 4,000 years ago, it would have been clear that this desertification was not some sort of temporary drought. Writing for the Journal of African Archaeology, Elena A. Garcia puts it somewhat tragically and bluntly. Quote, "After about 4,000 years ago, the recurrence of these alternating climatic events gradually came to an end. Desertification became an irreversible process, and the Sahara-Sahel border progressively moved southwards. Consequently, Gobero lost its role as a favorable location. It first became an occasional transient station, and then turned into a no-return frontier for its occupants." End quote. Wow. Like I talked earlier about not knowing what it would have felt like for the Kithians, but especially for the Tenarians, I can't imagine. I just can't. They had seen this people had been there before them, even if they didn't know their name. And I should say, these names, Kithian, Tenarian, these are all modern terms. We don't know what their names were either. But they would have known there were these people there before. And they were gone. And now they were being forced to leave too. And it wasn't even because of invaders or of them over-exploiting the land or of anything else. Anything inside of anyone's control. Just for no reason why literally the world would have seemed like it had turned against them. And as you now know, in a very real and literal way, it kind of had. Did they think it was their fault? Did they think they had done something wrong? You know, you hear stories of that like in different cultures all over the world in ancient days, since they didn't know about things like orbital wobbles. If something went wrong, if there was a natural disaster, they could blame themselves or people in their community. And I hope, oh my goodness, I hope that wasn't the case. Did knowing that the Kithians had been there before help them in some way? Maybe knowing that there had been other people before would have made it feel better. Maybe they thought someday they were going to come back. But unfortunately, as you guys probably are well aware, the Sahara has not had a greening like this since. These Tenarians, when they left this place, they were the last humans that we know of to be able to make a home here. And while yes, I know, people have managed to find ways to craftily make a living by traveling across the Sahara for millennia. I know that with modern technology today, we can basically live anywhere. But to live in the Sahara as it was, to see it in that way, to see the green Sahara and the world it used to be, it truly did. It ended with them. It wasn't just a point of no return for them. It was kind of the point of no return for all of us. And the Tenarians would be the last ones to see that wonderful lost world with their own eyes. But at least they've left us an incredible amount to learn from. What do you guys think? Where are your minds at? I admit, until researching this episode, I didn't know that humans had lived so long in the Green Sahara. It makes me wonder if there's other older settlements out there. Like Gobero is the oldest one and the longest inhabited one, but there's just still so much we don't know about this place, about this time. And what do you think about other ancient, maybe animals that could have just lived in the Green Sahara, that could have been specialists maybe? I keep thinking about that too. I don't know. That was incredible. I'm still thinking about, like I said, the idea of different ancient animals that would have lived back there. We've talked about that a couple of different times, actually, of places in the past that I know it wasn't really a different world, but it certainly feels like one. The Green Sahara is definitely one of those. And for our next story, there's also a bit of a complicated past. We're going to Europe now to look at some unique underground constructions that are unlike anything else found anywhere in the ancient world, and made by incredibly unique hands. In the 1990s, a team of cavers working in the southwestern part of France made a really unusual discovery. After digging through some earth and debris, they uncovered a cave that had naturally had its entrance sort of collapsed and covered way back in the Pleistocene period. And we're going to get a little bit more into dating later on, but just for now, you should know that this cave had been closed off for thousands and thousands of years. But despite all this, despite how long this cave had been sealed off from the world, it turns out one of our ancient relatives seems to have spent quite a little bit of time here. Now, we've talked about Neanderthals obviously on this channel before. We love our ancient Neanderthal friends here in the Lost Realms. We're very, very fond. And the last time we talked about them, I got a little sad. We were talking about some of the last Neanderthals to walk our planet. Well, today I want to do the opposite. Let's look at one of the oldest known Neanderthal mysteries left to us. And to do that, we have to go to this little cave in the southwest of France. Because once these cavers got through that entrance, they found themselves faced with about a 30-meter shaft, or rather a passageway that they were able to make their way along, though it wasn't always easy going. At times they were reduced to a literal crawl, getting on their hands and knees just to be able to progress. But after those 30 meters, they encountered something extraordinary. It was a huge open area, known today as the main chamber. Near the entrance to this main chamber were scattered the remains of large Pleistocene fauna. They also found evidence of bears, hibernation hollows where they'd come to sleep in this cave, and evidence of their claw marks. There was something made by our Neanderthal friends in this cave that's going to be the subject of our episode today, not anything done by these bears. Because after going through this large open chamber until you're around 336 meters down from the main entrance, down in the deepest, darkest part of the cave where there's no natural light, the cavers discovered what's now described as ancient circular structures created by Neanderthals. And this spot would end up proving to be one of the oldest known structures, man-made structures of any kind by any type of man, from anywhere in human history. But it would take them a while to figure out just how old this mysterious construction was and to start to piece together what they were looking at here, but we'll get into all that. We'll cover too what we know of this place, and we'll get back to that dating issue like I promised, and also how we know that Neanderthals built this and not early Homo sapiens say. But first, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Lost Bits. It's lovely to see you. As always, I am your host, Marie, and I'm so excited to share with you today a little bit of the story of the subterranean structures of the French Neanderthals. And guys, if you've watched my channel before, oh my goodness, you know I love underground stuff, but I'm also kind of scared of underground stuff, but I've been so excited to share with you a few details of this one. I've been reading about it a little bit now for a couple of months, and there's a lot to unpack here. We won't be able to cover everything right now, even if we want to, because a lot of this information has actually only become available in the last few years. Even though this place was initially discovered in the 1990s, its value wasn't really as appreciated at first as it should have been. But in the last few years, there's been lots of different info coming out, and I'm so excited. And I missed you guys. This is our first new bits in a while. I was so excited to get the Mega-Pak. And then the first part of Herxheim, that I didn't have time to make any more of these for a little bit, but I missed our weird history chats, and oh my goodness, it's time! We're gonna go underground again, and we're gonna see Neanderthals again. It's time! Oh, it's time! It's time for some ancient subterranean hominin bits. Oh my goodness. Okay, let's start by looking at these structures themselves in the main chamber. And I should clarify, when I say structures, there's 6 altogether down here. 2 that are called annular structures. Basically these 2 roundish circle structures you're seeing here, with the empty space in the middle. Then there's 4 smaller accumulation structures. Now all of these, from the 2 big circular ring ones to the 4 smaller piles basically, are made up of stalagmites. Literally stalagmites taken from within the cave that were deliberately broken off to use in this construction, and we'll talk more about the stalagmites individually here in a second. But for now, focusing on these structures. The largest of the annular structures, the 2 big circular ones, is 6.7 by 4.5 meters across. The smaller is 2.2 by 2.1 meters across. The 4 accumulation structures range from being 0.55 of a meter to 2.60 meters in diameter. 2 of these accumulation structures, these piles, are located within the largest of the annular structures, and 2 are located outside of it. And you can see from looking at these pictures, I think, an idea of the scale of this construction, all of which again is being done, remember, outside of the reach of natural light. It's in the dark or by firelight. And now let's look at those stalagmites, because oh my goodness, over half of the stalagmite fragments used are chunks deliberately taken from the middle of stalagmites, so they're not just using broken off hunks from the tip of one. Very few pieces altogether are whole stalagmites, less than 5%. They're described as being, quote, well calibrated with a mean length of 34.4 centimeters for the largest annular structure and 29.5 centimeters for the small annular structure, thus strongly suggesting intentional construction. And again, I just have to stress here the scale. Altogether, for total stalagmite usage across all of these structures here, they used around 400 pieces of stalagmite, comprising a total length of 112.4 meters and an average weight of 2.2 tons of calcite, the mineral that makes up these stalagmites. Like, that amount of weight and stone being moved is just mind-boggling. Now, marks nearby on the floor of the cave show where some of these stalagmites were wrenched from, but honestly, that makes up a minority. For a large part, we don't know where most of these stalagmites were actually taken from. Now, the 2 annular structures are composed of 1 to 4 superposed layers of carefully aligned stalagmite hunks. Some smaller pieces were placed on the inside of the layers as if to support them. Other stalagmites seem to be placed like vertically aligned to add support to the structure around. Traces of fire was found on all 6 of the structures. 57 of the stalagmite pieces, what archaeologists studying the place refer to in their research as speleophax, showed reddening and fissures in their surface from prolonged fire damage, and 66 were blackened, all of which had been burned as well. Now, I will say at this point, there is no cave art or anything like that has been found yet in here at all. But as you can see, we already have quite a lot here to work with, but also a lot of questions. But maybe first we should talk about dating a little bit. In the 1990s, when they first started doing excavation down here, they took one of these burned bone fragments they found in the structure and did radiocarbon dating on it, and found that there was no radioactive carbon material left in it, meaning that these burned bones and the structure had to date to at least before 50,000 years ago, which hit the limit of carbon dating. Research was meant to go on beyond that, but the lead archaeologist at the site at the time in 1999 unfortunately passed away. At that point, work there for quite some time halted, but in more recent years, a multidisciplinary team went down there and looked at the calcite accumulation on the stalagmites that had gathered there since they were put there by the Neanderthals when the whole thing was constructed, and were able to positively date that these structures were built by people well over 175,000 years ago. And as you're seeing now, that's a conservative estimate. And this is incredible and brings us back to, well, how do we know that Neanderthals built this? Well, that's because Neanderthals got to Europe a long time before we did. They were here on the continent at least 400,000 years ago. We modern Homo sapiens only got here around 54,000 years ago. That means it couldn't have been Homo sapiens that built these structures. It had to have been Neanderthals. They were the only ones here at this time. This is mind-blowing, and like I said, makes it one of the oldest known constructions of any kind in human history, by any type of human. But what does it all mean? I mentioned in the intro a little bit that this whole main chamber area isn't exactly easy to get to. Some of that initial entryway passage, you have to get on all fours to crawl through. This is truly a deep, dark part of the cave, and if you look at this map that I'm showing you here now, you can see that it extends far enough. There's even its own little lake in there. And so far, no other access has been identified but that one entrance that we know of. But despite this one entrance and its quite difficult to get to location, the researchers do think that the Neanderthals were coming back here for potentially thousands of years. But yeah, eventually the Neanderthals would have stopped coming here. And like I said, this cave ended up closing due to natural causes in the Pleistocene, and it seems that us modern Homo sapiens never got in here. So when these cavers came in and discovered all this in the 1990s, they were literally the first Homo sapiens to ever lay eyes on what you're seeing right now. The Neanderthals that built this would have never seen one of us. So that makes trying to figure out what all this was for a lot harder. Like we talked about in my Thorn episode, Neanderthals in some ways, though they were so much like us, and I am not saying this in a judgmental tone, they were also clearly working on a different mindset, I guess, or world viewpoint than you and I are right now. Again, I don't mean that in a derogatory way at all. Very pro-Neanderthal channel, as we've discussed. They were clearly capable of art and symbolic thought and abstract thought, but they've left us none here. Some archaeologists have cautioned against reading too much into these structures, pointing out that even chimps and orangutans can build structures in the wild, but again, looking at the amount of weight and time it would have taken to move and make all this, and the difficulty just in getting here to do so, this was clearly a massive undertaking. And while we do have other ancient structures like this built by ancient hominins, nothing to this scale and not in this deep cave setting. And it's proved something of a contentious topic in the archaeological community. One person I read in a news article even tried to suggest, well, maybe this is all built by cave bears, which makes absolutely no sense to me, considering the evidence that I just told you about the careful positioning of the still. Anyway, I think that person was just not thinking hard today. This is clearly a deliberate construction, and an amazing one. Researchers working on a study for Nature.com summed up some of the important questions about our structures, saying, quote, "What was the function of these structures at such a great distance from the cave entrance? Why are most of the fireplaces found on the structures rather than directly on the cave floor? Based on most Upper Paleolithic cave incursions, we could assume that they represent some kind of symbolic or ritual behavior, but could they rather have served for an unknown domestic use, or simply as a refuge? The Neanderthal group responsible for these constructions had a level of social organization that was more complex than previously thought for this hominid species." End quote. And to be honest, guys, I want to say here, we're kind of getting to the edge of our knowledge here and what we know. There's one stalagmite tip that was found partially hollowed out, and I'll put a link in my sources to a research paper on a lot of this that has some more in-depth details on just some cool stuff about the cave. But honestly, this is getting to the point where we're going to have to wait and see. What are your guys' thoughts? I am tempted. I was just making fun of a lady for overusing the word ritual the other day. But there is so much deep symbolic meaning in caves. And this is so mysterious. I don't know. I could see it, though, being maybe for some practical use, too. This is just more evidence that points to what we've known in recent years and that we talked about earlier in the episode, that Neanderthals were so much more complex and intelligent than we used to give them credit for. You know, they've recently found evidence of them using colored ochres and shells for body ornamentation and to spiffy themselves up. I don't know, this is an incredibly amazing sight. I feel like privileged that we're part of the generation that gets to see this wonderful thing that humans never before 1990 has ever seen. We get to look at pictures of this. We get to find out all about it as the archaeologists do their thing. This is such a gift. I know there's a lot of crummy stuff going on in the world right now, but we have to acknowledge these wonderful things too. My goodness, guys, it's just so lovely. And hopefully we will hear more soon. As always, I will keep you posted of anything new that comes out about this wonderful place. But I am going to stop there for today. Guys, let me know, like I said, what your thoughts are on this. It's such an unprecedented sight. Like, it's one of those few places you can't, like, that is unprecedented. There's nothing else quite like this in the world. Absolutely incredible. Wow, those underground, the rings, like, I feel like that's one of those places that until they show, like, I'll bring it up again here, one of those big, you know, aerial shots of the whole underground structures, like, it's not clear how impressive they are. I also love this map that I kept showing you guys, like, just the coloring, and it makes it so clear what we're looking at. And I have to say, in the comments it was brought up, and I was thinking along the same lines too. It sucks for this one that we don't have proof that it was Neanderthals, but instead we're relying on the fact that we're quite sure that humans weren't in Europe at this point. But we're learning so much more. It feels like every single week about different hominins and different human history in completely different places than we used to think was even possible. So I don't know. This is one of those ones that we know about it. We've uncovered a little bit about it. I feel like there's more story for us here, and hopefully we learn more about it in the future. For our next story, we're going to be heading to Scotland to a mysterious ancient carved stone plaque. A naturally formed stone plaque, just basically like a giant rock covered in petroglyphs that's incredibly ancient and mysterious in origin, and that the local government has taken drastic measures to try to keep safe. About a 20-minute drive from the city of Glasgow in Scotland, there is one of the most amazing examples of Neolithic art that's ever been uncovered anywhere. It bears a wealth of unique inscriptions across a wide stone plaque in the earth, a naturally occurring one. These inscriptions are similar to those seen in other places across Europe, known sometimes as cup and ring marks. And they are fascinating and they are beautiful, and this spot just outside Glasgow is thought to be the best example of them anywhere, or at least one of them. But unfortunately, you can't see it. In fact, no one can see it. I can't see it either, and that's a shame. I mean, other than in these pictures. And that's the thing, we've known about it for a very long time. There's references that hint at this ancient monument of art as far back as the 12th century CE. It's been the subject of mass publications and some strange paintwork and a whole bunch of other stuff. This place is amazing, and now it's nestled in between some housing developments and some power lines and all the other trappings of modern society. But unfortunately, it's just one of those things that you want but you can't have. You can't go see it. And I wish you could. I wish we could. It's been kind of stuck in my head now for a few days. It's called the Cochno Stone. But there's been other names attached to it too over the years. But we'll get into all that. We'll get into the history of this place, and what we know of it, both ancient and modern. And that's what's kind of so interesting about this one, guys. It's kind of almost a story of two competing histories in a way. I don't know how else to put it, but it is. It's fascinating. And I know we were just in Scotland recently. Don't worry, we're going to be moving around some more soon. But like I said, this one's just been stuck in my brain. I had to share a little bit about it with you. It's very, very cool, and hints at a much larger historic artistic legacy. But I got myself distracted again. As I was saying, hello, welcome, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Lost Bits, the place where we talk about unusual and mysterious parts from our past together. As always, my name is Marie. I am your host. It's wonderful to have you here. And we are going to be looking, like I said, at one of the best examples of cup and ring marks. And I saw a couple different people mention these in the comments recently, and you guys kind of got it stuck in my head, so let's talk about it. Let's talk about some Neolithic art in Scotland. It's Neolithic artistic bits. Oh, we're gonna sound so fancy in here now. Oh my god, you guys. So I think it would be helpful to start by looking at what Scotland was like literally at 3000 BCE, because that's when these inscriptions were probably made. And this would have actually been kind of a really milestone period in British history. During this period in Britain, only 1,000 years earlier, agriculture had come onto the scene, around 4000 BCE. This new technology of farming is believed to have been brought to the British Isles by boat by people whose background is still a little bit mysterious. This revolutionized life on the British Isles. And from 4000 BCE all the way on to around 2000 BCE, we see the construction of some of the greatest monumental structures in British history. Windmill Hill, Silbury Hill, Woodhenge, and the famous Stonehenge would all be built during this period. And you'll notice that puts our 3000 BCE date of the carving of these spiral, cup, and circle marks right smack dab in the middle of this both economic and agricultural, but also in a way cultural revolution happening in this whole place. And let's talk more about the cup and ring marks that we see on the Cochno Stone, and also in other places, because like I said, these are found in many locations across the British Isles, but also as far away as places like Spain and Switzerland. In fact, there's a long list of a surprising amount of different countries that play host to cup and ring marks that look a lot like these ones. But I'm not trying to suggest this was all one cultural behemoth extending over all these territories, but it's just interesting to keep in mind. And frankly, we don't know what the cup and ring marks at the Cochno Stone, or at any of these places for sure, what exactly they mean. There's been numerous theories put forward, and to be honest, the markings might have different meanings for different people at different places, at these different points in history. But just focusing back on our Cochno Stone here, like I said, it's believed to have been carved around 5,000 years ago. And the name Cochno comes from the Gaelic term for little cups, which is how it's referred to in that 12th century reference I mentioned to you at the start. Theories have ranged about the cup and ring marks on our Cochno Stone, from it depicting celestial events or mythological legends, to perhaps even being a type of map for different places in the region that people might need to know about. And to be honest, the Cochno Stone was never really lost. Locals always knew about it for basically time immemorial. But it started to attract more public notice in 1885, when a Reverend James Harvey came and surveyed and wrote about the place, and cleared off parts of it to look at it. And this is the part where, like I said earlier too, there seems to be like two histories here, because now the Cochno Stone it has kind of its own modern history. And after Reverend Harvey wrote about it and the public started to become more aware of it, eventually it caught the eye of a very famous archaeologist for the time, a man named Altamura Man. He had a fascination in general with the Bronze Age, and he had excavated many other sites around Glasgow already, which, by the way, there's a lot of other sites of interest nearby our Cochno Stone. In the 1930s, he developed an intense interest in the site, and he certainly helped raise public awareness of the Cochno Stone for sure. But he also went a little too far, and he started painting in the symbols with different colored paints, and he painted on a grid system of his own design there too, and he started to sort of build his own complex mythology around what he thought the symbols on the stone meant. He ended up developing and working on all these kind of strange theories about defeating eclipses and other cosmological events, which, I mean, there's nothing wrong with having out there theories, but I wish he hadn't painted on the stone. No, don't do that, you know. And by the 1960s, the place had become kind of a popular tourist destination. And like, you can see some images here. Actually, I think these are from the 1930s during Man's time. But still, like, people would walk all over the stone and visit the stone and would carve their names and initials and things in the stone. And I mean, during the time of Harvey and then Man, they did learn a lot. Like you saw, they uncovered the stone completely. They eventually uncovered that the kind of domed, sloping, natural rock that all of this was carved on, the stone plaque itself, is roughly 8 meters by 13 meters. It's huge. And that's something I do want to stress too, that all these beautiful carvings are stretched out across a wide area. But by 1965, the stone had become so vandalized that it was decided to bury the stone for its own protection. This was a very controversial decision that many of the locals of Glasgow absolutely hated and still do to this day. And it must be said that the local community at the time doesn't seem to have really had a lot of say in the matter, which I think is important because there were lots of tourists coming to the site, and yet the authorities seem to mostly blame the vandalism on the locals. And that's hard to hear about because especially the local little community closest to the stone, a place known as Fayfleet, is really devoted to the history of it and to keeping the story of the Cochno Stone alive. So the vandalism done there wasn't necessarily done by the locals. And in 2015 and 2016, a team of archaeologists came in and excavated the Cochno Stone. This was a huge deal for everyone locally and for the archaeologists, and they worked carefully, uncovering only parts at a time over the course of those 2 years, combining this fieldwork with modern technologies to create extensive and 3D imaging of all the symbols carved into the Cochno Stone. It would also allow them to just assess the stone's condition after being underneath all this dirt for so long. And I know these first images of the Cochno Stone don't look that impressive. It was pretty worn down by the time it went into the earth, as you can see. But when we add the 3D, yeah, look at this. It's amazing. I know I've been stingy with the photos until right now, guys, and okay, here, look. With the color removed, it's almost better sometimes. Like, look at the detail. Ugh, it's amazing. Okay, and there's those little feet. Okay, I know I pointed them out in text earlier. Look at the little feet. That's not vandalism. Those are weird ancient little feet. Now, as you can probably imagine, when they did all this, it wasn't an easy task. Just to uncover the Cochno Stone from all that dirt. Not only did the archaeologists have to work hard, but it took the support of the local council, the private landowner that this rock now is on, and Historic Environment Scotland. And also the archaeologists mentioned really touchingly later on that many locals came up to them during the course of their excavations to share their past memories about this site that they had growing up. There's many people still there that remember before it was covered up like this, and they have many, many fond memories of the Cochno Stone. Even the local fire brigade got in on the action and used their hoses and their water to help spray some of the dirt off the surface of the stone. And once the archaeologists had finished their excavations and their studies and those images and scans I told you about, it really meant a lot to them to still try to do right by this site and the community. And so after all the work was complete, and after talking it over with the locals, the decision was made to rebury the Cochno Stone again. And though I think it was still controversial for some, it was felt that this was the best way to protect it for the future. Though that doesn't mean that burying it up again was easy either. Archaeologist and senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow, Kenny Brophy, who worked extensively on the project, said in a statement, quote, "It is emotional when you have worked on a project such as this, touched it, walked on it, and closely examined it, to then rebury it. But for now, that is what we have to do to protect it from the elements. Perhaps in the future, this site could be turned into a major tourist attraction in Scotland with a visitor center. Who knows?" End quote. And I have to say, I'm wondering that a little bit, actually. Why couldn't they protect it by putting a visitor center around it or something like that? Lots of other sites have things like that. Why did they have to go this hard? I don't know. I do have mixed feelings about this one at the end, and that's why it's kind of been in my head so much. On one hand, I totally get it, and I'm proud of them for making this tough decision to keep it safe this way. On the other, man, I wish they could find a better way to protect it than hiding it again. Would you like to be able to go see the Cochno Stone, or are you happier knowing it's under the earth? Let me know your thoughts. I admit, I still have mixed feelings about that one. I am in full support of the idea that the Cochno Stone deserves special measures taken to keep it safe. But I can't help thinking, and I saw people bring it up in the comments too, well, why don't they put a visitor center over it, or like some glass over, like plexiglass or something over the stone? Why do they have to bury it? It feels like they went so hard. Oh, I love the Cochno Stone. I wish we could still see it. Anyway, maybe in the future that will change. Up next, we're traveling to primarily the Middle East, but we'll pop into Europe as well as we take some time listening to one of the more gruesome stories from the days of the Crusades. On November 27th, in the year 1095 CE, Pope Urban II, the head of the Roman Catholic Church at this time, would issue a sermon that would change the course of history, though not necessarily in a great way. See, a group known as the Seljuk Turks, a Muslim tribe from the steppe region, had recently come through and taken over large parts of Byzantium, the head of the Eastern Christian Empire and home of the Eastern Orthodox Church at this time. These same Turks had then gone down and taken the holy city of Jerusalem. And this, of course, caused a massive uproar in medieval Christian Europe. Now, the emperor of Byzantium at that time had already gotten help from his Western contemporaries a few times before this to deal with invaders and other problems. But now he was asking for something different. He was asking for help from Christendom to take back his territory, sure, but this also opened up a whole new opportunity for the Western Christian Church, specifically for our friend Pope Urban II. Like I said, Jerusalem was considered by Christendom, and still is, to be a holy city, and houses many Christian relics and places of note. It's also famously a holy city for Muslim people and Jewish people, but importantly for medieval Europe. Now Pope Urban felt that this could be a holy responsibility that the church and her people could take on. And certainly in a way he was correct. There are numerous accounts from the time that show that Christians were being persecuted in Jerusalem underneath the Seljuk Turks' rule. And like I said, the Emperor of Byzantium had asked for help. And today, if a Christian nation asked for guidance from the Pope, or if there were Christians being persecuted somewhere, we would expect the Pope to say or do something. There were stories of women and children being taken off into slavery, or Christians being tortured. To take back this holy city for Christianity would be something glorious and beautiful in the minds of the people at the time. And not only that, but it would have some very practical benefits for Pope Urban. Not only would this give his papacy a huge boost of prestige, but if Luke could be brought back from the holy city, that would bring riches, which the medieval church loved. It would also solidify the church's authority, and also bring together, if they could truly get a group of people to go down to Jerusalem, well, to be able to do so, they would have to amass a large force. So you would have, for the first time, all these Western European nations sort of gathered together in a way that could be directed by the Pope, by Christianity. And further, well, today, the sort of Catholic old school Christian churches are famously broken up into a bunch of different sections, but perhaps the biggest are, the Western Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. This schism between these two groups had only happened relatively recently, by the time Pope Urban would make his famous speech. So it had to have been in the back of Pope Urban's mind that if he could take back the holy city of Jerusalem and help his Byzantine friends with their invading forces, then, well, he's kind of set up there to be like the hero, isn't he? Maybe, if he played his cards right, he could end up with a whole church once again, with himself as the leader. So he did on November 27th of 1095. He sent forth a sermon, a message to all of Christendom, saying that if any lords or nobles were willing to put together their resources and their fighting men to go down, to take the holy city of Jerusalem for the Christian people, well, not only would they be heroes, not only would they be certain to get loot and booty, but maybe even more importantly, all of their sins would be forgiven. They would be heroes on earth and saints in heaven, welcomed and beloved by the sometimes vengeful God of medieval Christianity in a way that most could only dream of. Now, I'm not sure even Pope Urban knew how successful his little speaking campaign would be. He set up recruitment centers around different churches and monasteries, and many lords and nobles did. They were like, okay, sure, yeah, this sounds great. And they started getting their shit together to go down and take this city. But you'll notice I keep saying lords and nobles. Like, Pope Urban never meant for like the average person like you and me with no necessarily sieging experience to go down and try to fight off the Turks. That would be ridiculous. That would be a bloodbath. That would be nonsense. That would actually probably hurt the cause. But the thing is, medieval Christian Europe, I don't even know how else to put this, but it was kind of a nightmare. The average person, again, just like you or me, would not have been landowners. They wouldn't have had any, there was no middle class really, as we think of it today, to speak of. There was the aristocracy and there was the people below, the serfs, the peasants. And up to 90% of people in medieval Europe were peasants. So almost certainly if you and I were to be born back there now, we would be peasants. And I want to stress that because peasants were very little better than slaves. They didn't own the land they worked on. They didn't really have any rights. They could be traded like animals. And the life expectancy for people at this time was almost horrifically short. Up to 50% of children that you produced would die before they reached the age of 1. This means that the average life expectancy for a landowning male in Europe at this time was only in the early 30s. And frankly, I just told you the vast majority of people didn't even have it that good. They didn't even own their own land. So the average life expectancy for just regular people was almost certainly lower than the early 30s, which is almost insane to think about. That's how rough and tumble medieval Europe was. I can never understand why some people romanticize it so much. And the only thing getting the everyday person in Middle Ages Europe through every single day was basically the church. The church was everything. It was your whole life. It was the most powerful organization in Europe at this time, and very sin happy. This is, again, we're talking medieval Christianity, very, very sin happy, and a lot different from maybe the Christianity that we're used to today. Even more so. I know, there's still, I know, I'm aware. But it's hard to even just describe how different it would be back then, even to the worst of today. This is the world into which Pope Urban was sending out this message. A world in which the vast majority of people that were born would not live to see the age of 40. It's a world where there's diseases around you constantly that you don't know how to deal with. It's a world where basically your environment in general is scary and dangerous on a very daily basis. And it's a world where a God above is often as terrifying as he is loving. To the people of this time, Pope Urban's message was incendiary and glorious. He had thousands and thousands of people, anxious lords and knights and nobles that wanted to get in on this, but even more so, and perhaps understandably, the average person wanted in on the Crusades. The average person maybe had no other chance for glory or financial stability or for the hope of heaven if they lived in a strict enough religious community like this. There are people who would have truly thought this was their only way to achieve something good for themselves, something different, something with a greater purpose than just the slog where you're constantly working until you die, something noble. But not only that, Pope Urban in his speeches, he really hyped up the innocents being hurt angle, those pilgrims being attacked or possibly sold into slavery or worse. He told stories of the gruesome, horrific injuries suffered and the indignities and abuses taken by good Christian women and children, and made it clear that if anyone could possibly go and do anything about it and they chose not to, then God would condemn them. And in the society at that time that was super structured and super patriarchal, well, that certainly had very negative sides, but it also meant that the primarily male audience he was speaking to would have genuinely felt a moral obligation to do something. And again, he was making it clear that God above expected them to do something. And not long after Pope Urban made his first speech in 1095, that same year, a very unique man known as Peter the Hermit started making the rounds, answering the Pope's call. Now, Peter, we know almost nothing about his early life. We know he was probably born in France, probably around the year 1050, and there's some information that says that he may have been to the Holy Land before the Crusades started. But if he was, that same information also suggests that the Muslims there may have captured and tortured him. So Peter had a very personal reason, perhaps, to want this crusade to take off. He wanted to take down the Turks. He wanted glory for Christendom. And perhaps most importantly, it seems like he may have wanted some vengeance. He started going around and talking to different people and all common people and telling them that it didn't just have to be for the nobles and the lords. It could be for everybody. Everybody could have this chance at salvation, at doing right by God. If you just listen to Peter and you just go on this crusade, you could do something amazing for yourself, for your faith, for your God, and for your family, for your community. And he attracted thousands and thousands of common people and a couple lesser knights that didn't have the money to go along with the main crusade. And he got all these people and decided that yes, they were going to go on their own version of the crusade. They were going to go to the Holy Land and take it back for Jesus. The Pope, this wasn't what he had in mind at all. And this was not an officially sanctioned movement. This was the exact opposite of, in fact, what he wanted. Like I said, he wanted those big knight and lord armies to be marching down on behalf of the Pope. He didn't expect a multi-thousand group horde of just average kind of what he would have thought of as riffraff. But they were determined, and they had the faith of God, and they had Peter, their precious, wonderful Peter, leading them. And so they did. The People's Crusade, as it came to be called, took off before the actual knights and lords did, because they would come later too. But they were actually getting their supplies ready and planning and getting equipment together. These guys with Peter, the People's Crusade, they didn't have any of that. They had a lot of zeal and a lot of faith and a lot of determination, and that's basically it. None of them, other than the odd knight, like I said, the odd poor knight, would have had any sort of battlefield experience. Or if they did, it would have been minimal. And certainly nothing like a huge siege experience like you would need to take a city like Jerusalem. They had no provisions, no food to take with them. They had no money really to speak of. No equipment, nothing. They just set out planning that God would provide a way. Which, I mean, on one hand, it's nice to see people with convictions and following through on them. But on the other, I do want to stress here, at no point did God come down and tell them, hey, you should probably do this. They're relying on this Peter dude. And Peter didn't know F all of what he was doing. That's what I'm going to say there. And Peter, along with another man known as Walter the Penniless, that also seems to have been leading them, really just kind of lost control of the whole group. Infighting was rampant. They kind of split off into different sections. Some people just started going home because they realized this was not going to go well. And others just started terrorizing the countryside because, again, they had no food or no equipment. So when they left France and started marching towards first Constantinople, trying to get ships to go over to the Holy Land, they couldn't even feed themselves. So they started foraging and at times pillaging outright from the countryside. And when they got to Constantinople, there was almost none of them left. And the ones that were starved and bedraggled and just kind of, I don't want to say weird, but they weren't doing well. And they were not well received by the people of Constantinople, who just thought they were kind of bizarre and violent. Meanwhile, remember how I said they kept kind of splintering off? Well, there was a second wave that was coming after Peter of this still People's Crusade, of just kind of like the hangers-on of the poor crusaders. And this second half was even worse than the first. They had no resources again, and not only that, but they got mad that things weren't going the way they wanted, so they took out their rage on different communities of Jews and other minorities they encountered on their way to Constantinople, and they did it more once they got there. These pogroms committed against the Jewish communities at the time were absolutely horrible. And I want to make it clear, too, that even though, yes, anti-Semitism was huge in Europe at this time, even the people of the day, even the Christians of the day were like, no, this is horrible. What are you even doing? And in the end, almost all of the People's Crusade in both waves of it following Peter the Hermit, almost all of them were either killed around this time through all this fighting, or eventually Alexius I, the Emperor of Byzantium, the one who had wanted help and now was having to deal with all this nonsense, shipped a bunch of them off to Asia Minor to, yeah, sure, go to the Holy Land, where they were immediately destroyed by the Seljuk Turks, who actually had more fighting experience and knew better what they were doing. But not all of the members of the People's Crusade would be shipped off to Asia Minor, and not all of them would die. Peter the Hermit, for one, didn't. And some of his followers, too, would survive. And those that did, if they didn't go home and give up, would wait with Peter. And eventually, not long after, all those lords and nobles and their armies that Pope Urban had truly been calling for, well, they would set out too. And the remnants of that People's Crusade and Peter would join them. So now it looks like some of them were going to get to go to the Holy Land. But what they encountered there and what they themselves would end up doing is as far from holy as I can possibly imagine. Now, some of this is probably starting to sound familiar to some of you because I talked a little bit about the First Crusade in a recent video I did on exocannibalism. Ever since then, I've really wanted to talk to you guys a little bit more about them. Because I brought them up in that video, but I didn't have the time to give them the treatment they deserve. Because guys, these are some of the most ferocious and terrifying sounding exocannibals from anywhere in history. But there's also a lot of mystery about them. Some even argue that they never existed at all, but I think that's a little bit heavy-handed. We'll get into all that. We'll get into what we know of the Tafurs and what all this has to do with the People's Crusade. But first, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I am your host, I'm Marie. It's lovely to see you. Welcome to Lost Bits, the place where we talk about unusual and mysterious parts from our past together. And I'm so excited to share a little bit of this story with you. It's been on my mind ever since I uploaded the exocannibalism video because this is just such an interesting topic, and it's one that even though it happened, way back in the Middle Ages, in some ways, as I was researching the Tafurs, there's so much of their story that feels very relatable and very modern. But because actually, you guys, we are going to be talking about some kind of messy things this time. I don't normally do this on a Lost Bits episode. I save that for the other series, but even though I'm sure you guys know what you're getting in for from the title, just so I don't have to feel guilty, respectfully, and I never do this here, but thank you. I appreciate it. And I can't wait to share a little bit more about these guys with you. This is going to be exciting. It's going to be fearsome. We're going to have some heavy siege action. We're going to have some crazy religious leaders happening. We're going to have some crusader cannibal bits. Oh, that's new. We've never... Oh, God. So far I haven't really mentioned the Tafurs at all. I just told you about the People's Crusade. And the reason I started with that is that scholars think, and I kind of am tempted to agree with them, that the later Tafurs we hear about in the later accounts of the First Crusade might be the remnants of that People's Crusade. Or if they weren't technically part of that unofficial movement, they're identified, as we'll see, heavily with Peter the Hermit, and they follow him closely. And Peter was only really active and recruiting people during this time. And the Tafurs are also identified early on as being from the poorer classes. So understanding this, whether they were officially part of the People's Crusade or not, we can view that as a template for how we should view them. But other than that, the origins of the Tafurs are a little mysterious as like a distinct group. Also mysterious both with the Tafurs and throughout the First Crusade as a whole is The topic of cannibalism. The earliest accounts of the First Crusade, written by contemporaries only a few years after it all ended, do mention cannibalism happening, but they talk about it in terms of survival and something that was done in secret as a shameful thing. Europeans in general were not okay with cannibalism. It's not the universal taboo that people think that it is, but it certainly wasn't something accepted in that culture at that time. Now, the First Crusade itself has a long and gory history. We're not going to be covering all of it here today, but many of the Crusaders, even sort of the well-fortified and rich ones from that second group, the proper group, faced starvation and many challenges before they reached Jerusalem and once they got there. Now, they were eventually successful in taking Jerusalem and taking the city in 1099, but it was only after a bunch of other sieges and literally, like you've heard now, years and years of work and planning and difficulty. And frankly, many heavy sieges, most famously at Antioch and Ma'ara before getting to Jerusalem. Facing starvation during some of these sieges, the earliest accounts from the time, like I said, do mention survival cannibalism. But the accounts of it are very fragmented and scarce, and sort of reflect the European mindset towards such things at this time. And of course, all the European accounts always portray the Crusaders as being involved in a holy mission, divinely ordained by God to carry out whatever actions they have to take Jerusalem back for Christianity. Now, unfortunately for them, not long after the First Crusade was done, in 1187, Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt, took back Jerusalem. And this led to a whole new wave of accounts of the First Crusade being published in Europe as different groups tried to build momentum towards forming a second crusade to go back and fight down there again. And some of these accounts are actually really beautiful, epic pieces of French poetry, but they also contain some very horrifying details of what went on during these sieges and battles of that First Crusade. And it's these later accounts where we first get the mention of the Tafurs. And how they're portrayed is both fascinating and kind of unsettling. The first mentions that we hear of them in the stories of the Siege of Antioch and Ma'ara, they're described almost at first as being kind of pathetic and sympathetic people. They're recognized as being followers of Peter the Hermit, and the fact that they are not high-born and wealthy like the regular knights and lords involved in the fighting is made very clear. Quote,
"Had you been there, you would have seen countless tattered rags, countless long beards and matted heads of hair, countless thin and desiccated and faded bodies, countless twisted spines and swollen stomachs, countless crippled legs and feet sticking out at all angles, countless burned calves and worn-out shoes."
End quote. This description of them as sort of the wretched poor and starving, that's why they're talking about the swollen bellies. The starvation that they faced, especially during the sieges of Antioch and Jerusalem, was horrible. The Tafurs are described too as walking in front of the main Crusader army, just grabbing bits of grass and herbs to eat as they go. They're so hungry. And part of this was by choice. By following Peter the Hermit, they apparently agreed to give up all money and all possessions and just live off whatever they could forage as part of their devotion to God. They appointed apparently a leader to themselves, known simply as the King of the Tafurs, or King Tafur, who held some sort of discipline and authority over them. And they make it clear that this whole group was devoted and zealously following Peter and this extreme ascetic lifestyle, walking around just naked or in rags, eating just whatever they could find, with the only goal, the only single focus in their mind, to get to Jerusalem. But here I have to stop and remind you too, they didn't start out that way. Remember that all of these people would have been just average everyday farmers and people back in Europe. That's how bad already things have gone. People that were just living their daily lives and seduced by this idea of heavenly reward, to now a few years later after Urban's initial proclamation just being this kind of ravenous, hungry, ramshackle group that's just willing to do anything at this point just to get to Jerusalem. And it's not long after these initial portrayals of them that we start to get the first instances of them being blamed for cannibalism. Because, like I said, in the earliest accounts of the First Crusade, it wasn't really blamed on the Tafurs. Like, they weren't even mentioned, actually, in the earliest accounts. It was just vague crusaders that were poor and starving. But now things have changed in these later accounts, and we'll talk about in a second why that could be. But most importantly, we start to see here too, not just a transformation in who's doing the cannibalism, but also the type of cannibalism. Now, all accounts agree that at the start, the cannibalism that was practiced during the Crusades was done by necessity, purely for survival, because they have nothing else to eat on this trip, on this journey. The accounts also make it clear that it would evolve into something much darker and much, much crueler. And it's around the time of the siege of Antioch that we see these sort of darker trends develop. Because it's during this siege of this city, even though they'd already experienced food scarcity at this point for literally years, that things went to a whole new level. Quote,
The army was in a terrible state, devoid of all provisions. Nobody could offer anybody else any help or even moral support. The filthy weather had caught them out completely. Poverty reduced them to eating their everyday horses, while the spirited horses brought from Spain suffered so badly from hunger that they ate their halters and hurt their faces.
End quote. And once they even got in the walls of Antioch, through in the city, they still hadn't completely won. There were still forces of the opposition there. And frankly, the food situation didn't much improve. Quote,
Our Lord's people suffered such a time of scarcity that even the very richest went hungry. The princes soon felt serious ill effects. Fat bodies became weak, as did their war horses, whilst the rank and file were completely desperate. They raced to pull up plants by their roots just as they were, leaving neither leaf nor root uneaten. If anyone could lay hands on raw donkey thigh, it cost him 60 shillings, and not a penny less, with a lucky purchaser needing all his bargaining powers. Anyone in a position to buy a small loaf was happy to pay a whole bezant of pure gold. They skinned donkeys, horses, and mules, boiling and roasting the flesh so they could eat it. The skin, complete with hair, was barbecued over an open fire, and the sergeants and squires ate it just as it was without bread.
end quote. But during all this, the later chronicles written of the First Crusade make it clear, too, that these holy warriors would never give up, no matter what happened or what awful things they had to go through. They were not leaving until they had taken Antioch and eventually Jerusalem. It's in this environment that eventually the Tafurs came to Peter the Hermit, who, like I said, they were following and they thought so highly of, and who the Knight Crusaders, the proper Crusaders, had actually put in charge of the poor, which is hilarious because they had to have known how bad he did that first time. But anyway, the king of the Tafurs goes to Peter the Hermit to stress how badly the people are doing and to ask for help. And the chronicles record the conversation going this way, quote,
Meanwhile, back in the Christian army, scarcity was the order of the day. There was little of any food, and morale was low. Lord Peter the Hermit was in his tent when the king of the Tafurs came to see him, accompanied by more than 1,000 of his followers. All of them had stomachs swollen by hunger. My lord, they said, for holy charity's sake, tell us what to do. In truth, we are dying of hunger and deprivation. Lord Peter replied, That is because you cannot bring yourself to do what needs to be done. Go and fetch those dead Turks lying over there on the battlefield. They would taste perfectly all right if you cooked and seasoned them properly. The king of the Tafurs said, You're right, you know.
End quote. And so they did. The Tafurs went out and started roasting and eating the dead Turks, oftentimes in full view of the Turkish people still holed up in this city of Antioch, much to their horror. And while it started out as a way to alleviate hunger, the records make it clear, like I said, it didn't end there. There's stories of the Tafurs acting almost animalistic, barking like dogs and having long, sharp teeth and tearing hungrily into the flesh of the dead Muslims, all while the people trapped inside the city cry and look on. There's stories of them deliberately capturing women and children and making them watch as they eat their relatives, and stories of outright and abuse. And while the chronicles do start to view this with horror and revulsion, they also make it clear that all of this terrified the Turks and had a really good effect on demoralizing them. And it was for God, and it had to be done. And so the Tafurs are presented in one way as these animalistic, almost savages by the end of these chronicles, of these later accounts, but they're also portrayed as someone that you should pity and kind of have respect for. Modern researchers have pointed out similarities between how writers back then at the time wrote about Mongols and other groups that they disliked, and also how they write about the Tafurs. The languages used to describe both are very similar, except it's always made clear in these First Crusader accounts that these can serve a purpose, or as being like a lion or some wild force that the Crusaders have managed to wrangle into control, into using to terrorize the Muslims for the good of God. And after the crusade is over, it's not made clear exactly where they went to or what happened to them. Can't tell if any of them ever made it home. Did they all die there, or what happened? I'm not sure. Peter the Hermit, though, would eventually go back to France and open a monastery, and he had a great life despite all the trouble that he caused. And the First Crusade would eventually be successful by medieval Christian terms. Like I said, they took Jerusalem eventually, though I will say the level of bloodshed shown was staggering even by European standards of the day. And like I said, they weren't able to hold the city, so in the end it was almost kind of all, I don't want to say pointless, but my goodness. And because some of these accounts of the Tafurs and what they were doing there, and just the whole drama of it all. Now, some modern historians have argued that the Tafur might not even be real. They do make a convenient literary device after all. It's the barbaric but well-meaning poor that's engaging in cannibalism, not the fancy, proper, knightly crusaders. Even at the time, Peter's whole movement was really viewed with a lot of scorn by some of his contemporaries, who sometimes were just acting off elitism, but also just, again, kind of practical reasons. None of the people he recruited had any siege experience, really. Like, they didn't know what they were doing. Peter basically led all of them to either their death or this horrible fate of having to rely on cannibalism. And while I do think the tales of the Tafurs are probably quite exaggerated, we know the People's Crusade was real, and those leftovers had to go somewhere. It would make sense to me if the Tafurs existed in some form or another, even if maybe some of the details now are fuzzy. But I can understand seeing them as sort of a plot device too. I guess I'm not really sure. But one thing that really did strike me really, really hard when I was researching both the exocannibalism episode and this extra stuff about them is that the Tafurs really, in some ways, this is going to sound crazy, you guys, so please stick with me for a second. Or maybe it won't. They remind me of Jim Jones, or rather Jim Jones's followers from the People's Temple. I'm sure most of you have heard of this already, but just in case there's someone, I don't know, that's not familiar with their cult history, Jim Jones started a cult known as the People's Temple that eventually led to the mass and sometimes forced suicide of hundreds, over 900 people were killed eventually by Jim Jones. Many of them children. But this didn't happen all overnight. He started out a charismatic preacher in California, specifically going to the poor and minority groups, people that felt disenfranchised, and saying, hey, I can help you. I can give you this wonderful, wonderful thing. I can show you the Word of God. And also, by the way, can I say, I have a soup kitchen. I have a shelter you can come and stay at. And that's actually how Jim Jones first got notoriety. He was thought of as this wonderful, caring, very equal opportunity preacher. He deliberately went out of his way to seek out a very specific type of spiritual seeker. People that didn't feel like they belonged in regular church groups and didn't feel like they were getting the help that they needed. And so they did. At first, people flocked to Jim Jones because he offered them something that they couldn't get any other way. He offered them a place to feel safe, to have a noble goal to pursue, to chase God by following this kind, wonderful man's vision. But the reason that he was doing that wasn't because he wanted to help disenfranchised groups, it's because they were easy to target. And eventually, like I said, it all ended up in disaster, but not because the people were just stupid and following him to their death. Jim Jones was famous once he got established for the horrible deprivation tactics he would use, starving his followers, keeping them isolated, keeping them awake for hours and hours at a time, keeping them in fear. And there's been lots of modern day research done on the psychological effect of things like this. Scientists have confirmed when you take away all the basics that a person needs just to get through their day. When you take away their food, you take away their sleep, eventually they become really suggestible. It's hard to think clearly when you're tired. It's hard to think clearly when you're hungry. We sometimes think of people joining cults as if they're stupid or something, but again, most research has shown the opposite of that. There's very smart people that join cults, but they don't get wrapped up in it immediately. It's through this process. And I know a lot of you know this. And I feel like too, even as I say this, a lot of you maybe are seeing why Peter the Hermit and all of the People's Crusade and the Tafurs, if they existed, it reminds me so much of that. It reminds me of the same feeling. Like, I'm not trying to say that Peter the Hermit was trying to start a cult the same way as Jim Jones. I don't think that was his intent, and I'm not trying to push that as a theory. But what I am saying is you have a guy targeting people that don't feel like they're being helped or heard any other way. You have a guy going around to people who are going through some really rough stuff in their lives and convincing them that if you just do what I say, God will take care of you and everything will be wonderful. And you're going to be part of a holy mission. And then, what do they have? They have years, literally, of marching with no food, being constantly under attack, constantly going places where they're not wanted, with no equipment, no knowledge or experience to back them up. And Peter clearly wasn't that great of a leader, was he? Things kind of fell apart really quickly for him. You have people living in fear and desperation, and the only thing holding them together is this holy, noble mission that they're on. So I can't think of the Tafurs and not think of those at the People's Temple. I'm not trying to imply, oh my goodness, that the victims of Jim Jones were cannibals, not at all. But the thought process, that's not something that's unique to the Crusades or Peter the Hermit. It's not even unique to Jim Jones and cult leaders. We see this all over the world, over and over again, all the time. People that started out just like you and me, and slowly, just through stress and deprivation, and sometimes the conscious will of evil people, that get turned to evil actions. And in some ways, I think this is why I want to talk about it today. I feel like in some ways, the story of the Tafurs is one of the saddest I've ever come across in human history. As horrible as it is, it's like that cult mind think, but on a huge, multinational, multi-year, multi-atrocity level. Now, did the story of the Tafurs play out like it says in the Chronicles? Does this all have any bearing, or can it teach us anything about cults and cult think-like behavior today? I don't know. And to be honest, moralizing, even though I know I'm getting dangerously close to it now, was never the point of this episode. In fact, I think weirdly, I'm only kind of realizing it as I say it out loud right now, I think I want to defend the Tafurs a little. Like, that's what I just decided. That's the point of this episode. Because even if they were just as bad as the stories make them sound, even if they were as horrifying and as exocannibalistic and awful as they seem in these tales, well, that's because they were freaking made that way. They were made that way. And I know that doesn't completely remove them from responsibility, but diminished responsibility at the very least. Like, when I think of them right now, I don't feel disgust, I don't feel hate or shame, I just feel bad. And I wish I could help them. But I am going to stop there for today. Guys, let me know your thoughts. What are your thoughts on all this, on the Tafurs? Do you think that they were real? Do you agree with me on the kind of deprivation, stress angle, maybe leaning to it? Or do you think I'm maybe being too easy on them? You're allowed to disagree with me. Either way, I want to hear from you. Let me know below. Well, that one was a bit of a heavy one for me. I still feel bad for the Tafurs. And I never know if I'm saying that right either. I'm not sure. And I want to say too, I'm well aware that some people think that they either didn't exist, like I mentioned that in the episode. Some people think that they were just made up. Or if they did exist, they're being used as a scapegoat for other Crusader actions. That's all entirely possible. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that even if they were as bad as they're being portrayed, my goodness, look at the circumstances they were under. And that Peter the Hermit, I hinted at it in the description box for the original episode. I've never seen a man so bad at hermiting while claiming to be a hermit in my entire life. He spent that entire story wandering around barking orders at people and leading crusaders into battle and stuff, and just like running basically a cult. I didn't hear about him hermiting once. He wasn't in no cave or on no pillar or nothing once. That's some of the gosh darn worst hermiting I've ever seen. Anyway, up next we're going to go down to Africa and look at not just one ancient stone monument, but literally an entire region covered in ancient stone monuments, all of mysterious and fascinating origin. Monolithic stone circles have fascinated us for hundreds of years. We've covered and shown some on this channel before. And some of these ancient monuments and structures that have been left to us from the past are truly breathtaking, but maybe none are more so than the stone circles of Senegambia. These ancient monuments, made up of carefully hand-carved slabs of laterite that vary in weight and size, are actually, despite the name, not just made up of actual stone circles. The term Senegambian stone circles is kind of a catch-all name for these monuments in this location, and there are a lot of monuments in this location. The ancient structures known as the Senegambia stone circles are a collection of monuments spread out across a wide area, spanning a territory covering some 350 kilometers long by 100 kilometers wide. And in the total of this area, there's well over 1,000 stone monuments here. But I should stop and say here too that even though I think sometimes, especially here us in the West, when we think of ancient stone circles and monolithic structures like this, we think of Europe, the Senegambia stone circles are in Africa. The name Senegambia comes from the two countries from which this region of monuments gets its home, the modern-day nations of Senegal and Gambia. And to be honest, there's still a lot of mystery about these ancient structures and who built them and why. And I will make it clear too, it's not just stone that these mysterious ancient people have left us behind. They also left so much more personal effects for us to learn from. And these remains of the actual human ancestors that may have built these amazing structures both shed some light on this place and also raise a few disturbing questions. But we'll get into all that. We'll get into too what we know of this place, and I'll be honest with you guys, this one's going to be a little bit of a shorter one because we still have a ton of questions about this spot. But first, let me say, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Lost Bits. I am Marie. I am your host. Welcome to the place where we talk about unusual and mysterious parts from our past together. And I'm so excited to share with you a little bit of the stone circles of Senegambia. These circles and monuments are absolutely fascinating. They raise a lot of questions, and you'll notice I haven't mentioned a date for them yet. That's actually a little complicated. Like I said, we're going to talk about all that. And it's wonderful. We're going to jump into a little bit more African history. We don't come here enough, and I'm so excited to... Oh my goodness, you guys are going to love these. These are so cool. They're so distinctive. They're very, very unique. And we know just enough here to get the mind racing, but too little to be able to answer any of my big questions. So let's do it. Let's do it. We're ready for some mysterious African bits. This is going to be fantastic. Oh my goodness. Okay, maybe the first thing I should make clear is that when I say that there's over 1,000 monuments in the Senegambia Stone Circles region, I'm not joking. There's so many monuments in this space that the whole area itself is broken up into 4 distinct zones. The Sine Ngaine and Wainar in Senegal, and the Wasu and Kerbach in the Gambia. And across these 4 zones, the monuments and circles are spread across 93 individual sites. Now across these different sites and these different zones, like I said, not all the monuments are the same. There are stone circles, there's double stone circles, there's different rows and posts. There's different types of pillars, such as these distinctive V-shaped pillars, which you can see were carved with great care. And also there's just non-stone related monuments here. There are burial mounds all throughout this region. And even if we just want to stick out looking at the stone circles themselves, there's also just a lot of variance here. The circles range in size with regards to diameter, the height of the stone pillars or monoliths that make them up. And depending on the size of the stone circle as a whole, it could be made up of only a dozen pillars or over 20. And going back to the burials for a second, some of these stone circles had burial pits underneath of them. And in fact, many of these burial pits and the burial spots throughout this region seem to have been grouped together to form different necropolises. But it's worth noting that there's many different types of internment shown here. Some are full internment burials, like they're fully buried in the ground just right from the start. Some seem to be the remains of secondary burials, where the body was processed a certain way in another location before its remains were brought here for its final resting place. There's also evidence of cremation that's been found here. And also, as you can see from some of these images, there's been a little bit of confusion because in some areas it almost seems like a bunch of bones or people were just kind of hucked together. And there have been some researchers that have speculated that we are looking at some of these bone pits at evidence of human sacrifice. Some have even suggested maybe some people here were buried alive. But to be honest, the modern research consensus is that there sort of isn't one. People are a bit up in the air on that lately. So I throw that out as a topic of interest, but not necessarily saying that's what we're seeing here. And even though the human sacrifice and buried alive angle has been thrown around a lot for these pits, and you guys know I don't mind calling that out when I see it if you've watched my previous episodes, anthropologists have also put forward some really good theories that what we're seeing with these bone pits here at Senegambia is instead a type of communal burial. In some of these pits, there's over 50 different people that have been interred in one spot. And evidence found in these pits by archaeologists also seem to point that maybe these bodies were all together in some sort of container or vessel underground at some point first. And then over time, that's rotted away. And what we're left with is just this hunk of bones, basically. So exactly what type of burial we're looking at here is still kind of a matter of debate. But it is fascinating, especially all the different types of internment styles. And again, I have to stress just how big this site as a whole is. Like I keep saying that there's over 1,000 monuments all across the Senegambia stone circle region. Well, if you break it down altogether, the number of discovered stone circles or monuments adds up to 1,053, with a combined total of monoliths used to make these monuments of, and this is incredible, 28,931 of those big individual laterite monoliths. That's insane, with several different researchers pointing out the level of societal complexity and organization it would take to construct all this. And actually, I should say as well, when we look at these stone circles here in Senegambia, you should know they didn't originally look like this. There's been found remains of like wooden posts and other things that lead them to believe that these stone circles, many of them anyway, seem to have been originally filled in with earth, or at the very least as part of a larger structure. And here I think it's a good time for us to finally get to that dating quandary that I brought up with you before. Because as researchers started excavating some of these graves in more modern time and doing different dating methods for different remains found at the site, because actually at this point I should say, it wasn't just human remains that were recovered from Senegambia. Pieces of pottery and jewelry have also been found. But anyway, once they started dating, well, my goodness, did they make an unusual discovery. The earliest evidence of humans using this place for this stuff comes from around the 3rd century BCE. But the latest graves at Senegambia are only from the 16th century CE, meaning that this place was in more or less continuous use for well over 1,500 years, which is just absolutely mind-blowing. And taking that into context with the different types of internment and things found here at Senegambia, most historians now feel that what we're seeing here is the evidence of different people groups and different cultures coming here and using this same spot communally for over a very long period of time. And some have suggested that the Senegambia stone circles can't be thought of as being the remains of one culture at all, but many. Now, what led people to choose this site and keep choosing this site over and over again, we're not sure. Some evidence points to this place originally being quite a bit more forested in times past, but honestly that would have changed before they stopped using this as a place for burials, you know what I mean? And there are some that have pointed out, like I said, not all of these are technically stone circles, that they might not all have to do with burials. Some have pointed to perhaps astronomical connections with how the stones are laid out. Most who study the circles now, though, do seem to think they're mostly funerary in nature, and they've been looking to the heritage and history of different African peoples to try to find parallels to what we see here. to try to better understand what's going on. And actually, there are many different cultures, some in the past and some in the present, that do have similar funerary traditions and amongst different cultures of African peoples. Small circles of upright stones surrounding a paved area are present in many villages in southeastern Guinea, Sierra Leone, and northern Liberia. Small laterite monoliths similar to the ones used here at Senegambia can be found at the still active sanctuary of Tiko at Sogada. And one very common theory put forward by researchers recently is that the Sura people who live today in parts of the Gambia and Senegal, that their ancestors built these structures. And the people themselves, the Sura, they have long claimed that they have a deep ancestral connection to this place, and that yes, their own people at one point did build these. They have long oral traditions of storytelling about this place. Now, does that answer the mystery of the changes in burial styles, or the whole ritualized mass burial versus human sacrifice thing? Not yet, but hopefully as archaeologists work more at the site in collaboration with the local people, they'll be able to discover more. And so now researchers are working off the theory that this is what we're looking at, is the history of the Sahara people along with maybe other cultural influences over a mass period of time, marking this whole place as even more beautiful and unique than we already thought it was. It's literally like a cross-section or timeline of West African burial practices and related cultural customs over a long period of history. And not only do I think that's a logical theory, but certainly one, like I said, they believe themselves. So it's worth taking seriously. But I do want to say here that the Sura people and their accounts of the stones and their history are not even the only local ones about them. Remember, our set of monolithic structures covers a wide, vast territory, and there's many different people groups that have lived in this area over time. Some local legends claim that the circles commemorate dead Ghanaian kings from the historical Ghanaian Empire, which, I mean, if you look at the timeline, that could certainly fit for some of the graves we see here. Others talk of spirits living amongst the stones. As recently as the early 1900s, archaeologists excavating part of the circles in one of the zones was greeted by angry locals who felt that an earth spirit lived there, and disturbing the ground would disturb the spirit. In more modern times, archaeologists and anthropologists have put forth theories that the burials and the stone circles that we see here might all have to do in some way with sun worship, bringing it back to astronomical connections. And so you can see we have a lot of different theories here. Also, I should say too, when I talk about this whole place as being grouped necropolises, or as it being multiple graveyards used over a long period of time by West African peoples, that itself can mean many different things. Does that mean that these were all peoples that were connected to each other and knew each other in different cultural groups that were related? Or did it just happen to be a convenient place for different cultures that were in no way related to come and bury their dead? If that's the case, there are certainly lots of common themes though, like the pillars may be different. Some have accumulation piles, for example, and some don't. The heights are different, the widths are different. Did one culture start doing it and then go away or die off, and then another people group just came into the territory and saw it and was like, oh, this is a spiritual place, we'll do the same thing. See, there's still so much mystery here, even though we've uncovered so much. But we're now starting to get, unfortunately, to the limits of our knowledge, like always happens to us. And at this point, most of the papers that I was looking at and reading for researching this episode, we get to the point where, it always in the conclusion, well, more research is needed, more research is needed. And hey, that's not me ragging on research. Hopefully we do get more research. That would be lovely. This is the largest concentration of sacred stone circles found anywhere, and is described by most anthropologists as being a large sacred landscape. And I think that's the best way to think of it. This is a beautiful, beautiful site. But I will say that the Senegambia stone circles have been a UNESCO World Heritage Site now for some time. And hopefully we will learn more in the future about the people that made this incredible place and their history. But I am going to stop there for today. And guys, thank you so much for being here with me for a little bit of the story of the stone circles of Senegambia. And guys, let me know what you think of this one. I always love to hear from you. Are you thinking too with the human remains, human sacrifice? Or are these just complex burial practices that we don't really understand? What are your thoughts on this place being the remains of different cultures and groups? Or maybe of some of these monuments not having anything to do with burials at all. I admit this is one of those sites that I feel like I have just enough that I want to know more. Darn it, give me more info, people. But anyway, I will keep you posted of anything else I find. It is a fascinating place. Guys, let me know your thoughts in Senegambia below. The Senegambian stone circles are one of my favorite mysterious spots on our planet. I think they're so distinctive and beautiful on one hand, and I just love that, some are associated with burial mounds and some aren't, and some seem to be tied to different astronomical. There's just so much there. And it's an area with so much rich history too. I'm glad that it's starting to get more attention in recent years, and hopefully it'll be the site of even more archaeological study as time goes on. Up next, we're going to dive into the mysterious ruins of Puma in South America on the shores of Lake Titicaca, and take a look at the extraordinary architectural techniques it would have required to build this amazing, mysterious place that has influenced both people and empires for centuries. Lake Titicaca in South America is both the largest freshwater lake in South America and just one of the largest in the world. It's also, in terms of elevation, the highest of the large lakes, sitting at 3,810 meters above sea level, and is one of less than 20 so-called ancient lakes on Earth. And this body of water is thought to be at least 3 million years old, covering 3,200 square miles. It's situated between Peru to the west and Bolivia to the east, and lies in a vast basin that's named after the lake itself, in between different Andean mountain ranges. Because of this unique location and height, Lake Titicaca can face extremes in temperatures, and is just unique biologically for many reasons. But this whole basin that the lake is in has also played home to humans for thousands and thousands of years. In fact, the earliest evidence found so far of people living in the Titicaca Basin comes from 8,000 BCE, meaning that people have been living in this area despite the challenges it can sometimes face for at least 10,000 years. And the place we're going to be visiting today is one of the most famous and yet still most mysterious sites and cultures that has ever made its home along the shores of this mysterious ancient lake. Just off the Bolivian shore of Lake Titicaca, on what's known as the Altiplano, or literally a high plain, lies the enigmatic ruined city of Tiwanaku. This place has fascinated archaeologists and anthropologists and just people all over the world alike, ever since accounts of it started being written by international visitors when the Spanish came to colonize the region. And while the Spanish colonizers were shocked by the city when they discovered it, they were not the first people to stumble across Tiwanaku. And I must say too, it wasn't built just before the arrival of them. The Inca, perhaps the most famous of the South American ancient civilizations, also had their own stumble-across moment with Tiwanaku, because I want to make it clear, the Inca didn't build this place either. And the Inca were so impressed by it when they saw it as well, that they even incorporated this place into the mythology of their culture, and they came to believe that their creator god, Viracocha, must have resided here. Now, the Inca people, despite their fame, really had their height and flourished between 1400 to 1533 CE, at which point they were cut short by the arrival of the Spanish. But they had existed before that, at least in some form, since at least 1100 CE. I think this is all worth noting because even the Inca, like I said, they didn't know who built this place. And in fact, even today, we still don't know who built this place. We've named this elusive, mysterious ancient people that built this city, Tiwanaku, after the name of the city itself. We have no idea what they would have called themselves, and the name Tiwanaku comes from the modern-day Aymara people, a modern-day indigenous people of the region who today believe themselves to be the descendants of the creators of the city. It's the Aymarans that gave this ancient city the name that we use today, and Tiwanaku, if translated, means literally the stone in the center, referencing the fact that amongst their people, this city was believed to be the center of the whole world. And honestly, even just looking at the images of it here, I think it's easy to see why. It's an incredibly beautiful spot. And archaeologists have been working here now for well over 100 years to try to get to the bottom of all the questions we have about Tiwanaku. Unfortunately, they haven't yet. But perhaps there's no more telling and fascinating spot in all of this mysterious ancient city than a set of old would-be temple ruins known today as Puma. Now, I should say, just like all of Tiwanaku, Pumapunku's date of construction is the subject of a little bit of debate. As I mentioned earlier, people have been living in this basin in this general area since at least 8,000 BCE, but radiocarbon dating suggests that the earliest monumental structures actually built at Tiwanaku date to around 200 CE, though I say around as it's still a little murky. And because of that murkiness, there have been ancient aliens enthusiasts and others who suggested that Tiwanaku is 14,000 or even 17,000 years old, but this is based on extremely faulty data, and we'll talk about this stuff a little later. Now, all of Tiwanaku is stunning and beautiful, featuring large open spaces for religious activities, and fine stonework was everywhere. Beautifully carved temples were all over this place. It's not just the beauty of these ruins that have fascinated people, but instead how they're made themselves. The stone blocks that make up Tiwanaku as a whole and our site of notice, Pumapunku, are absolutely massive, each one weighing several tons. And the largest stone slab found at the site weighs over 180 tons. All of this stonework features precise cuts at perfectly straight edges. And not only that, but at our site specifically in Pumapunku, there are some really unique features that, in terms of building and construction, set this place apart from literally anywhere else in the ancient world. All of this displays a huge amount of technical engineering ability and has led scholars to speculate that the people that lived at this city and that built this city must have had complex knowledge of mathematics, engineering, and in relation to how some of these buildings are laid out, especially the religious structures, to line up with the stars or celestial events. They must have had great astronomical knowledge too. Which of course is part of what's led to the whole ancient aliens thing. People are curious about how an amazing place like this was built. And this is what makes Pumapunku in particular in the city so fascinating and why we're going to be focusing on it today. Because Pumapunku is a part of the city that was never completely finished. Here at Pumapunku, we can truly see how these people were actually building this place. And Pumapunku itself seems to have been a place of particular note and importance. So we can learn a lot from it. And in fact, just in the recent last few years, we have. It's one of the best examples. It shows us both instances of their big, unique, bold architecture and hints at the secrets behind it. But the fact that it wasn't finished, well, that points us a little bit towards the end of Tiwanaku as a whole, and about how what caused the fall of Tiwanaku and who caused the fall of Tiwanaku has repercussions and effects right up into our present day. But we'll get into all that. We'll get into what we know of Tiwanaku, what we know of where its people went, and like I said, we'll take a closer look at the specific spot of Pumapunku because there's so much for us to unpack here. But first, I can't get so carried away, I forget to say, welcome. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I am your host. I am Marie. Welcome to Lost Bits, the place where we look at unusual and mysterious parts from our past together. And I'm so excited to share with you a little bit about the Gate of the Puma and the lost stonemasons of Tiwanaku. And I know Tiwanaku is already incredibly famous, and this place as a whole has had people so fascinated for so long, and it's been such an important site and part of history to different cultural groups for so long that honestly almost every single stone of the city of Tiwanaku as a whole has been moved around and shuffled around and changed over the years. And lots of different groups, as you just heard me allude to, have tried to claim ownership over Tiwanaku. So people have been trying to find out more about this ancient culture and place for a really long while, but it's much more difficult than it may seem, even with all the ruins and remains that they've left us. I can't wait to show you some more about it. Okay, we have to just dive right in. It's time. I'm so ready. Are you ready? I'm so ready. We're ready for some ancient Bolivian urban bits? Oh my goodness, we sound so cosmopolitan. God, you guys. Stepping back and looking at the whole of Tiwanaku again. Well, initially thought by early archaeologists to be just a sacred site or location, we now know in fact that Tiwanaku was a bustling city. And like any city, it took time to grow. Well, like I said, the initial monuments were built at a much earlier date. It's around 600 to 900 CE that our city really reached the height of its heyday. Famous for its many mysterious gates and ruins of temples, and for the ruins of its pyramid today, it's easy to see why at first these kind of dominated the public imagination and people only saw the sort of religious aspect of the site. But researchers now believe that at its peak, this city may have housed as many as 40,000 people, with a carefully designed residential district in the city, and in fact the whole city itself was laid out spectacularly well on a grid system, very similar in a sense to the cities of today. And in fact, in the part of the city where the richest residents lived, known as the Putuni, there was even a water drainage system, a very sophisticated form of technology for this time period. And this technology is also seen in the sunken court at the pyramid at Tiwanaku. And frankly, as impressive as this would not have been even the only perk of being an ancient citizen of the city. The people that lived here had access to a wide trade network and would have been able to get extremely exquisite pottery, as well as items made of copper, silver, and beautiful shells. Both alpacas and llamas are native to this region too. But honestly, guys, I have to go back to that pottery for a second, because look at this! Look at this! Oh my goodness! Like, I feel like the term exquisite pottery or beautiful pottery really doesn't do this justice. Like, some of this is like, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Can we just bask for a second? Let's just bask. Okay, seriously, this is a spouted vessel made to look like a man holding a spouted vessel. They're doing meta pottery. Though perhaps even more impressive than their pottery, though honestly I feel like I'm lying saying that now, was the Tiwanaku people's inventive use of raised farming beds. Rain can be scarce at times in the Titicaca Basin. The construction of raised fields and canals to channel lake and rainwater helped make large-scale farming possible, both for the production of basic food and other things. They grew corn and made beer, though they had to migrate down to the lower elevation areas nearby to do it. And soon, in general, the people of Tiwanaku would spread out as their city grew to expand their influence and grow their culture in other places. And this whole period of growth and wealth and splendor from 600 to 900 CE had a profound impact on the city and its residents. Some of the art and architecture that decorate the ruins of Tiwanaku today is still absolutely breathtaking. Particularly of note are the religious images and statues that cover different areas of the city, such as this one depicting what's referred to as the staff god. And it also has to be said that this place, Tiwanaku, seems to have become an area of religious pilgrimage for many different local peoples in its own day and for many, many centuries after. In the lake by which Tiwanaku sat, Lake Titicaca, there are two islands that in their mythology seem to have come to represent both the sun and the moon. Pilgrimages would be made by people out to these islands and offerings left that archaeologists have started to recover and analyze today. And on the whole, the image Tiwanaku presents to us is one of an ancient, thriving cultural metropolis. And coming back now finally to the main topic of our video, Pumapunku. Its construction seems to have begun right around the same time that the city itself reached its heyday, sometime between 536 to 600 CE. Here we can openly see displayed the high precision holes that were drilled, and perhaps most strikingly we can see how they used here, you can see it, holes in geometric shapes to sort of turn the blocks themselves into almost like giant Lego pieces that could be connected together. Perhaps the most famous are these so-called H-shaped blocks, which were not only meant to be joined together, but actually have some other mysteries to them we're going to be talking about a little bit more soon. Now, again, this site has been sort of ransacked and rummaged through, and there's even a kind of shoddy reconstruction done in somewhat modern times. But that hasn't stopped researchers from trying to figure out what Pumapunku was supposed to look like if they had gotten a chance to finish it, or from trying to figure out how they were able to carve and make these huge stone blocks in the first place and just get them here. And in 2018, modern-day archaeologists and researchers started analyzing the literal stones themselves of Pumapunku and took samples of the stones back for them to look at under electron microscope. And this is the first time that anything like this was ever done, and they made an absolutely groundbreaking discovery. These H-stones that you're seeing here, and in fact many of these giant slabs of rock, aren't actually rock, or at least not in the way that you're probably thinking. These are artificial geopolymers. Basically, these were made using an ancient form of concrete. Yeah, you're looking at giant concrete blocks here. And in recent years too, based off of the remains at the site and other archaeological evidence, researchers started literally 3D printing different components of Pumapunku to try to put together what its finished form was supposed to be. And they eventually came up with a really intriguing model here. Look at this. This is very, very cool. But you can see how just studying this one part of the city has taught us already so much, even if we still have a lot of questions. And honestly, due to the complex engineering and technical innovation we see at Pumapunku, many in recent years have also started suggesting that, possibly this place wasn't even built by humans. This site of Pumapunku has become a favorite spot for ancient aliens enthusiasts. This is based on somewhat faulty data. Like a researcher in the 1920s came out and made some pretty wild theories, and they seem to sort of catch on. I admit in general, too, I am a little wary of ancient aliens theories because some of them, not all of them, but some of them smack of undercurrents of racism, and it makes me extremely uncomfortable. I will say that the dating now available that I gave you for this site does seem very accurate. I admit I don't really know how they built this place. I do genuinely believe that humans did so. And hopefully in the future, as more study is done, we'll learn more about the whole construction process, and that will put some of these sort of more fringe theories to rest. And I want to say in general, I'm not averse to the idea of aliens visiting our planet, but I need more evidence than someone just saying, well, this is really crazy, they couldn't have built this, which basically seems to sum up the ancient aliens argument. But hopefully, as the years go on, we'll find out more about how they did so and about what the ancient culture of the Tiwanaku people was like. Because unfortunately, as you heard me allude to a couple times now, the people of Tiwanaku are not still with us today. After that critical year, that year 900 CE, things all throughout the Titicaca Basin would start to change. A major drought seems to have hit this region at this time, and not only that, but different neighboring kingdoms as a collective started to rise up against the people of Tiwanaku. A group known as the Aymara Kingdoms, comprised of Kola, Lupaka, Kana, Kenchi, Umaseo, and Pakahe people, all combined their forces to attack and try to take down Tiwanaku. Meanwhile, infighting seems to have been rampant in the city. In this time of stress, the common people seem to have begun rebelling against their lords. During this time, many statues and monuments were destroyed. The Putuni Palace, where the rich lived, was also burned. People began to leave Tiwanaku and go and live in the countryside. And around the same time, their trade settlements in different places also started to be abandoned. We still don't know the exact causes behind all this, why they disintegrated the way that they did, or why these other people were so against them, if there was some reason just other than scarcity. Interestingly, the Aymara people today, which as you heard at the start is where we get the word Tiwanaku from, consider the city to be their spiritual capital, and they consider themselves to be the descendants of the people that built it. Which, I mean, in kind of a roundabout way, is probably true. Like I said, after the nobles and stuff were defeated, the common people seemed to have spread out across the neighboring countryside. And since it was probably the common people themselves that were moving and lifting and crafting the stone as opposed to the nobles, you could argue that yes, it probably was at least some of their ancestors that helped construct the city. And certainly it's not my place, a white girl from Canada, to tell them that they're wrong about their spiritual beliefs. I do want to note, however, that the nobles or kings or whatever of Tiwanaku that would have been paying for and ordering the city built almost certainly would not have considered themselves part of the Aymara collective, or they most likely would not have been getting attacked by them. But regardless of what happened to the inhabitants of Tiwanaku, by the time the Inca would stumble across this place some 400 to 500 years later, the only people left inside the city were the ones made of stone. As I said, this place would grab and have a particular hold on their spiritual consciousness. The statues and carved representations of deities everywhere made them think of their creator, Viracocha. They would claim that some of the statues here at Tiwanaku were ancient giants that the god had created before creating mankind. And eventually, Tiwanaku would have sort of a strange second half-life, and would become a pilgrimage center again, but this time for the Inca, who would travel here to this mysterious place where the gods lived, to present their gifts and prayers to those that had come before. And of course to Viracocha himself, who some archaeologists and anthropologists now believe was based off of, at least partly, the staff god you've seen here several times. So in a way, I guess we shouldn't feel guilty about being a little bit mystified by Tiwanaku. We're continuing a long tradition, and in good company. And there's something really magical about this place. Even just looking at it through pictures, I've never been lucky enough to go in person. I would love to. I don't know if it's just the landscape or the mystery of it all, but there's something truly primeval about Tiwanaku and the Pumapunku and everything else. A place that's become so legendary that even long-dead empires marveled at her. A place where the gods came to Earth, at least for a little while. And while many different cultural groups, not just the Aymara, have claimed some sort of stake in Tiwanaku over the years, regardless of talk of ownership, the effect that this ancient, beautiful civilization has had on us has been long-lasting and reverberating. The Incan and every other culture that came after the people of Tiwanaku would be directly and clearly influenced by their artistic and cultural and spiritual beliefs. While they may be long gone now, there's no part of modern-day South America that wasn't touched by them and partly created by them. The wisdom of Tiwanaku and her many secrets has outlasted her own people, the people of the Inca, the Spanish conquistadors, and now, as I sit here, I'm pretty sure it's going to outlast me too. But maybe that's okay, and I'm getting very, very deep into it now. I apologize. Like I said, this place has a weird effect on me. I can literally give myself chills, actually, if I think about it too hard. But what are you guys all thinking? Let me know. What do you think about Tiwanaku? Do you have any ideas on how it may have been constructed? I know some of the articles I read mentioned that there were specific grooves that were carved or drilled into some of the stone or concrete slabs, whatever you want to call them, to seem to make it easier for them to be moved by rope. I don't know, just the scale of the stonework is kind of breathtaking. Let me know your thoughts. But I am going to stop there for today before I get myself too wound up. That stuff with like the Lego holes in the blocks and everything else, I think that's still just so incredible and smart. The whole concrete thing, like that blew my mind. And there's so many different theories and thoughts about this place online and about Tiwanaku as a whole. It's become a subject of huge fascination for people, and it's easy to see why. And I didn't even really talk about it in the episode because the main focus was on their architectural skill. But there's a whole undercurrent of different religious tones and beliefs and things that we see here. Archaeologists have found the remains of human sacrifice at Tiwanaku, for example. And we didn't really get to explore that today. We might have to come back to Tiwanaku. No, just the whole region as a whole. There's so much good stuff down there. We haven't even really talked about the Inca yet. Oh my gosh. Up next, we're going to be visiting an old friend, and one I must say I'm incredibly fond of. In October of 1993, a group of cave explorers and speleologists, or cave scientists, entered into a cave system known as the Lama Lunga Karst. Now, karst is a specific type of terrain that's characterized by barren rocky ground interspersed with caves and sinkholes, and lacking the surface appearance of rivers or lakes. This is because karst landscapes are normally formed up of limestone, an extremely soluble mineral. And because of this, though like I said, karst landscapes often don't have lots of lakes or water at the surface, it's also characterized by lots of underground water that channels and eats and wears away at the limestone to make these caves and these sinkholes and these underground structures. And Lama Lunga Karst cave system that these cave explorers were entering in October of 1993 is sort of your classic karst cave. There are stalactites and stalagmites everywhere, as well as other different limestone formations, such as the famous cave popcorn that you're seeing here, all tying in nicely to what we know of that water and karst effect, and all hinting at the fact, too, that this cave system, the Lama Lunga cave system, like most karstic cave systems, has many different chambers and nooks and niches. And when these explorers in 1993 were puttering around in there, they opened up a new passageway that was completely unknown to them before. Specifically, they removed a column that had been blocking a pathway to a different area of the cave they'd never been able to get to. And it turns out that no one had been able to get to for a really, really long time. But they were not the first people ever in all of history to go into this part of the cave either. And this smaller chunk, actually, of the Lama Lunga cave system would soon get a very distinctive name, being later referred to by researchers as the so-called, quote, apse of the man, end quote. And, well, to be honest, it's easy to see why this little area that these cavers had discovered would soon get this name. Because in 1993, as these explorers slowly made their way into this little shaft, shining their lights around them and just seeing what they could see, what they discovered was a set of human remains, but not just any human remains, and not just from regular humans that the cave itself seemed to be slowly devouring. Looking up at them from below, as you can see here, the skull is angled upside down, and there's a little pile of bones and human debris beneath it. But it wasn't just the appearance of these human remains that would prove to be shocking, because these cave explorers would go out and report on their findings, and soon other scientists and people would come in to try to get to the bottom of who this person was that they'd found in this cave. And it turns out that that was both a much harder investigation than it initially appeared, and B, that the person that they'd found there, who the press would soon dub Altamura Man after a local nearby Italian town, had an even more unusual and in some ways tragic backstory than it initially appeared. But we'll get into all that. We'll get into everything we know of Altamura Man and how we think his bones ended up there and what those bones are up to today. But first, may I say, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Lost Bits. I am your host. I am Marie. Welcome to the place where we talk about unusual and mysterious parts of our past together. And I'm so excited to share with you a little bit of the story of Altamura Man. Now, we have a long history of holding a lot of love in our hearts for our ancient Neanderthal friends here in the Lost Realms. And I will spoil a little bit of mystery now, though you may have been able to tell from the lovely cranium I showed you, that our dear friend here, our dear mystery friend, was in fact a Neanderthal. Because we need another Neanderthal episode. We can always use more Neanderthal episodes. We can find some cool knowledge, and this one is a doozy, and it's time! We're gonna get Italian Neanderthal ancient mystery bits. Oh my gosh, it's like the fanciest Neanderthal bits we could possibly have. Now, I think it would be helpful to get more of a lay of the land. Now, you see this sort of map here. It's not really a proper map, but you see the spot at the tip top up there labeled number 1. That's that tiny little apse of the man where our ancient Altamura Man was found. And if you look down at the very bottom, the spot labeled number 5, that's the current entrance to the cave. So you can see the twisty-turny sort of passage it takes just to get to this one little secluded spot. Now, I want to make it clear too, even the section that you're looking at here is not a full image of the whole cave. Now you can see the blue box is the section we've just been looking at, and you can see in the yellow, this is the larger cave system that we know of it anyway, as a whole at this time. This being taken from a report on a scientific study, or rather, kind of a wave of scientific studies that took place here from 2016 to 2020. And going back to that image, that original image I showed you of Altamura Man, you can see again, upside down, and the huge amount of growth and buildup that's happened over his bones since he was interred there. And the reason I'm stressing all this again is because I think it's important for us to look at this point, how he ended up in this cave in the first place. Because Altamura Man's bones are not the only bones that have been found in this cave system. In fact, there are hundreds and hundreds of examples of animal bones. But this wasn't a place where humans or animals seem to have been living. Instead, at some point, at least a section of the roof of the cave just wasn't there. And different animals, and at least in one case a person, Altamura Man, seemed to have fallen through one of these openings or holes that may have been covered by brush or leaves or whatever. And then it just became like a death trap, and these animals and this person couldn't get out. And that's actually the running theory. Like I said, it's kind of a tragic backstory for our friend here. They believe that he fell into this cave and got stuck and couldn't get himself out, and eventually, unfortunately, faced an extremely slow death of either starving or dehydration, and just kind of ended up collapsing where he was and where he was stuck. Hence the bones kind of all under and beneath him there. And now I do want to go back to the animal bones that I said were also present in the cave, because some of those do actually show signs of gnawing and stuff. So there was, at least in some areas of the cave, different animal activity, but our human friends' bones don't show any of that. So researchers don't think they were disturbed at all from the time that Altamura Man died until they were found in the present day. And at some point, the opening over this section of the cave just got sealed off by sediment and debris and time. The remains of Altamura Man were just trapped in there. And I do mean trapped very literally. As you can see here in the picture, buildup of minerals in this cave, that cave popcorn I was talking to you about, absolutely cover Altamura Man's bones, all of them. And now they've started to literally be absorbed and become part of the cave itself. And because of all this, I mean, I've been talking casually about the fact that, yes, this is a Neanderthal, But for many years after these bones were first discovered, scientists weren't even sure of that. They were basing it off of basically what the cranium looked like, but Altamura Man is so ingrained into the cave itself that at this point in time, even as I record this in 2025, they do not know how to remove this person's remains safely from this cave without risking just destroying them. So they've been forced to sort of go down multiple times in multiple waves over the years to do different studies to try to learn whatever they can about him. It's expensive and very time consuming for research to be done like this. It really truly has been sort of consecutive pulses or waves of researchers and human effort. But now, as I record this in 2025, we do know a lot more. Like I said, we have an idea of how he got down there. And one of the first huge waves of researchers that did a ton of work in there from 2009 to 2016 conducted photographic investigation of the area behind the skeleton that physically people just can't get into, identifying in the process bones that appear to have been dislodged from the remainder of the skeleton. And they were able to recover parts of the scapula that they were able to use to actually date and do paleogenetic analysis on Altamura Man for the first time. And so this was actually when they first confirmed that yes, he was a Neanderthal for sure, but also just when he got there. And guys, this is kind of amazing, because by looking at Altamura Man's bones and at the calcite formations that have occurred on these bones, they were able to figure out that Altamura Man probably fell into this cave between 128 to 187,000 years ago. Now, this does not make Altamura Man the oldest Neanderthal fossil of any kind ever found, but I have to say, they've actually been able to sequence Altamura Man's DNA. So our friend has the distinction of having the oldest Neanderthal DNA ever sequenced anywhere. And that's not all. From 2016 to 2020, a whole new wave of research started down in the cave with Altamura Man, because now, again, people are starting to realize, okay, this is a super, not only interesting find, but a really historically valuable one. And as time goes on, more and more researchers are trying to figure out a way to basically get him out of the cave. And during the second wave of research as well, they were also just trying to come up with new ways to study him while he's down there. They used remotely operated camera equipment to once again go into areas further than the human eye could actually easily see, including right into his mouth, as you can see here. Oh my goodness, he looks so fresh right here, doesn't it? Oh wow. I know that's just the moisture in the cave, but oof. But anyway, they were able, due to the second wave of research from 2016 to 2020, to get enough full scans. They even got x-ray equipment down there in the cave, you guys. They went all out, and they actually put together a very workable reconstruction of Altamura Man's head. Look at this. So we can actually get an idea what he looked like. That's very, very cool. And while they were in his mouth there, they also did an in-depth study on his dental sort of layout, as I'm sure you can imagine. And here they made kind of another unfortunate discovery, and that's that our friend here seems to have been in poor health. He even lost 2 teeth by the time that he had died, which was really unusual. Neanderthals in general, I mean, they didn't have access to sugar, really, like we do anyway, no refined sugar. They generally had good oral health. They also discovered he was probably in his early to mid-30s when he died, and which, I mean, I know life expectancy was a little bit different back then, but he wasn't ancient by any means. That is incredibly unfortunate, and actually these newer studies also hint at kind of a deeper mystery for Altamura Man, because now that they've done this facial reconstruction, they've compared that along with the DNA that they've sequenced to those of other Neanderthals from around Europe at this time and in general throughout their history. And they found that our friend, Altamura Man, has characteristics both of the classical Neanderthal population and also of more what they're describing anyway as archaic hominin species. Like I said earlier, Altamura Man lived an incredibly long time ago. Researchers now feel he may be something of a bridge. A bridge between older, more primitive species and the Neanderthals. And it's kind of crazy to think about what the world he would have lived in would look like. I can't even really imagine. I mean, I know it's our world and it would be the same in a lot of ways, but just, I didn't even mention it, but they found hyena bones and stuff in that same cave. Like hyenas in Italy. You know, like that's the world that he was in. And there's still probably so much we can learn from him, but as of right now, like we talked about, he's still stuck in that cave. And there is, I promise you, a lot of very good minds working on trying to get him out of there. And it's actually that element that made me want to share his story with all of you a little bit. And I'm sure you can see why. The first time I read about him, which actually was a couple of years ago, I felt so heartbroken. It was just the idea of him falling in there and being stuck in there and slowly dying alone. And being down there for over 100,000 years and just I hated that. It really bugged me. But on the other hand, I think we can all agree that the cave seems to have kept him quite safe down there, even as it's slowly devouring him. I don't know. I guess it's weird. It's sort of an inverse of the Cochno Stone episode. If anyone's watched my Cochno Stone episode recently, in that one they deliberately buried a priceless artifact and monument to try to keep it safe. And I had very mixed feelings about that. And now, as I record the end of this episode, I admit there's a part of me I'm kind of flip-flopped, to be honest. I mean, I know we have so much to learn from him, but there's a part of me that, I don't know. He's already taught us enough, hasn't he? There's a part of me that just wants to let him rest, I guess, is what I'm dancing around. There's a part of me that wants to let old Altie sleep. But, I don't know. What are your guys' thoughts on all this? Do you think we'll be able to get him out anytime soon? What do you think of what we could learn about other ancient hominin species from him? Literally a 2023 paper on Altamura Man, they describe our friend very bluntly, saying that he's, quote, the remnant of an archaic population, which was probably not in simple continuity with the Neanderthal lineage, end quote. I mean, there's probably a lot to learn there. And either way, I mean, they're not going to ask me, but I'm probably being too sentimental. And who knows, maybe Altie would like to come up and get a little walking around room. Maybe he'd like to see some sunshine for a change. What do I know? I am kind of wondering, though, if they're ever even going to be able to get him out of there. I mean, that's a lot of cave popcorn. I love me some popcorn, but that's a lot of popcorn. I don't know. Let me know what you're thinking. Oh my, I love Altie. A prince among Neanderthals. Rest in peace, my friend. And I mean, it's wonderful that we've learned as much as we have from him, but I feel so bad for him stuck down there in that cave. And I loved what I saw some of you saying in the comments about how, well, maybe he died before he fell in or something. And I love that. Or like maybe the fall killed him, because I hate the thought of him suffering down there. At least he seems to be getting a lot of love now, though I'm still torn about that too. What do you guys think? Do you think we should be still trying to get him out of there, or should we just let Altie rest? Up next is the first of the brand new stories, which is about the Yamana Skull, which is a skull that was found in a place where you truly wouldn't expect to find one, and that has come to symbolize a global rush for mad power, while also just still being a human body part with a tremendously sad past on its own. On January 7th in 1985, a Chilean biologist named Dr. Daniel Torres was on this tiny little island called Livingston Island and picking his way across a beach. Now, he was there specifically to conduct a census of all the mammals living on the island, and was also just going around and collecting garbage. In typical biologist fashion, he cared about the environment he was studying, and as he was going along this beach, he noticed up ahead of him this really old plastic orange buoy, as well as just a big plastic container. And as he started to get closer, he noticed on the ground, literally amongst pebbles and rocks and some sand, there was this one big white stone that really stood out to him. And as he kept walking and removed a little more distance between himself and this strange object, he couldn't help but see that the stone had these strange lines on the top of it. As a biologist, well, he knows that they look exactly like the cranial sutures on a human skull. And his steps pick up and his breathing picks up and he rushes forward and he starts kind of digging into the dirt where this stone is. And it's not even really dirt. Like I said, it's sand, and specifically volcanic sand, a thick layer of it, but it doesn't matter. And eventually he lifts up the stone and guess what? It's not a stone. It is a skull. And it's missing a few pieces here or there, but it's very clearly a human skull. And this find absolutely staggered Dr. Torres, to the point that it literally almost knocked him off his feet. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Which, at this point, you may be wondering, well, I mean, he's a biologist, and I just covered in a short here on my channel, actually, that different bodies of water and rivers and things like that, you know, especially if they're near areas of human habitation or have been for a really long time, it's unfortunately not uncommon to have body parts wash up now and then, especially near major cities and things. And I mean, this wasn't right at the edge of the water. He would later report that the skull was found 40 meters from the shore of this beach. But still, to find this skull truly staggered him. And I think to understand why, I'm sorry, I have to backtrack here a little bit, because I told you that he's on a beach, on a place called Livingston Island. Now, Livingston Island is actually part of a chain of small islands that makes up an island group known as the South Shetland Islands. And some of you that know your geography just gasped a little bit, because the South Shetland Islands and this little beach that Dr. Torres had been picking his way across and had now found this skull on is off the coast of Antarctica. And while Dr. Torres was part of a Chilean research team that did have a base nearby, well, I don't think I have to tell you that there's not that many major urban settlements kicking around the coast of Antarctica. And certainly they hadn't lost anyone there recently. So who could this person possibly be? And not trying to be hateful or anything, but the skull, it seemed kind of old. It was kind of an imperfect skull. It was weathered. It had clearly been through some stuff. And so he immediately took it back to his research station, to what's known as the Chilean Antarctic Institute for Study, to show his colleagues and to try to analyze this thing, to figure out where it had come from and who it belonged to, and what he would discover about this skull. And in fact, the skull itself would not only change the course of history, but as I record this, all of you should know that this one hunk of bone might change all of our futures too, forever. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and we'll get into all that. We'll get into what we've learned about this skull. We'll get into why it's so important and how we think it might have ended up here. But first, before we dive in, let me just say hello. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Lost Bits, the place where we look at unusual and mysterious parts from our past together. I am your host. I am Marie. It's lovely to see you again. And this is a story that I've wanted to share with you guys for a while. I think it's so unique and fascinating. It's also going to be one of those ones that's a little tragic, but that's okay. We'll deal with it when we get there. And it is definitely also a story that's fraught with very real, present-day, modern world implications. So we just got to gather our wits. We got to brace ourselves. We got to just dive right in. It's Antarctic Archaeological Skull Mystery Bits? That's new! Oh, we've never done that before. Jeez. So to better put all of our story today in context, I think it would be helpful for us to look at the history of Antarctic exploration a little bit. Now, there's been stories of lost continents literally for millennia, but the first known explorer to for sure cross the Antarctic Circle, which I want to make it clear, just the Antarctic Circle, not to be nitpicky, but it is important. No one's landing on the continent yet, but just the circle that you see on the screen here. The first time someone crossed that was Captain James Cook, who famously did so in January of 1773. Though some have put forward the idea that theoretically, some people could have gotten past that Antarctic Circle mark even earlier. For example, the ancient Polynesians are even famous with us still today in modern times for their seafaring abilities, and a 2021 study published in the Journal of the Royal Society of New Zealand theorized, based off of looking at the oral traditions and other aspects of Maori culture, that the Maori themselves may have reached the waters of Antarctica and even laid eyes on it as early as the 6th century, which is interesting, and I wouldn't put it past them, but unfortunately we have no physical evidence of that at this time, so we'll just go on from the James Cook moment there. But I do want to make it clear too that Captain Cook, he entered Antarctic waters and passed that Antarctic Circle, but he never actually saw the continent himself. That wouldn't happen until January of 1820, when a man named Thaddeus von Bellingshausen reports seeing an ice shore of extreme height during a Russian expedition to the region. A British expedition around the same time also reported seeing high mountains covered with snow. This would trigger a new wave of exploration, and over the next 50 years and then onwards, more and more expeditions from different places and led by different people would find their way down here. First, just getting used to circumnavigating around the continent and around all the ice, and then eventually progressing until in 1899, for example, Norwegian Karsten Borchgrevink became the first person to spend the winter in Antarctica, and also the first person to bring dogs and dog sleds here. Not too long after, between 1901 and 1904, Robert Scott, Ernest Shackleton, and E.A. Wilson began a trek to try to reach the South Pole, but were unfortunately unable to do so. Shackleton would attempt again between 1907 and 1909 and also fail. And finally in 1910, both Shackleton and Scott in separate parties set out to both try to reach the South Pole. Famously, Shackleton did, and unfortunately Scott and his party would pass away in the attempt. Now, we won't keep going with every single visit to the continent, but I think you can sort of see both how fascinated we've been as a people for a long time with this place, and also the inherent dangers of it. And frankly, Scott and his team and their tragic passing, though they're the most famous, they are far from the only people to die during their visit to Antarctica. One BBC article I read while researching this episode even referred to Antarctica as a frozen graveyard, and that's unfortunately not far from the truth. And these deaths didn't just occur during the times of Scott and Shackleton either. There was the tragic passing, for example, of Jeremy Bailey, David Wild, and John Wilson in October of 1965, where the heavy-duty vehicle they were driving across the ice, a muskeg, fell about 30 meters into a giant crevasse. And while two of the men died either immediately from the fall or directly after, one of them, Bailey, was stuck down there alive for some time. His colleagues attempted a rescue, but unfortunately it was impossible, and all three men would lose their lives. And in even more modern days, in August of 1982, Ambrose Morgan, Kevin Ockleton, and John Cole, after crossing some sea ice to reach an island where there was a small shelter, a base for them to stay at, to conduct research. Storms blew in. The sea ice that they crossed over was destroyed or blown away by the winds and the force, so they ended up being stranded on this island. But at first that wasn't even a concern. They just thought the sea ice would eventually reform in a few days, and the hut there, it was prepared for instances like this. It had enough food in it for a month. But the winter of 1982 was a particularly rough one. They ended up stranded there for weeks before the sea ice would reform enough for them to even try. And though they maintained radio communication with their comrades on the mainland, this didn't make the situation any more bearable. Some of the food in the hut ended up being way older than they thought it was, and it made them very sick. Penguins surrounded their hut, which sounds adorable until you realize they were pooping and cawing and just doing penguin stuff 24 hours a day, and the men just couldn't get any peace. And as they ran out of edible food, they had to kill and eat some of these penguins just to survive. Eventually, the sea ice would reform, but unfortunately, it didn't stay for long. Though by the time the ice had broken apart again, when the mainland people tried to contact our friends stuck in the hut, they got no reply. They kept trying and trying and trying and hearing nothing. And eventually, when the weather would allow them, they were able to go eventually to the hut themselves, to the island themselves, to try to figure out where they were and what had happened. They knew that the batteries for the radio was running low, so they hoped and just hoped that they were, they were maybe living very, very rough, but they were managing out there. But it turns out when they got to that hut and to that island, there was no one there. And in fact, the bodies of these three brave men were never recovered. The running theory is that when the ice did reform briefly there, the men saw their chance and took off across it to try to get back home to base. And then unfortunately, when the weather came back in, they were trapped out there. These are just a few of the stories of the challenges and terrors that can face explorers going down to this dangerous place. And so bringing it back to our mystery skull and to Dr. Daniel Torres, when he first found the skull, I'm sure he must have thought it was some sort of remnant of an Antarctic explorer or something like that. And he did, like I said, he took it back to the base, to his own base, to the Chilean research base. And they immediately started analyzing it to try to figure out where it was from. And keep in mind that Dr. Torres found this skull again in 1985, which would only be a couple of years after that second group of three men was lost on that sea ice. So it had to be in the back of his mind that he was probably looking at the remains of some scientist or researcher just like him who had faced a really tragic end out on the ice. But that's where this story takes an incredibly incredibly bizarre turn. Because it turns out the skull that Dr. Torres had just found, once it was dated, well, it was not from any recent Antarctic explorer. Because that skull, when Dr. Torres picked it up, was over 175 years old. And now today, as I record this, is around 200 years old. Way before the earliest Antarctic explorer ever set foot on any part of the continent. And that wasn't even the only bombshell. Because after examining the skull closely, they realized that most likely, this was the skull of a woman. And frankly, women have a much shorter history on the Antarctic continent than men do. And not only that, but further research showed that, well, perhaps Dr. Torres was drawn to her for a reason. Because it's now been identified that this woman was an indigenous person from Chile. Yeah, a place literally almost 1,000 kilometers away from where the skull was found. And again, keep in mind the times we were given. If she died roughly 175 years before it was found by Daniel Torres in the 1980s, that means that she's thought to have died between 1819 and 1825. What in the wild blue yonder was a Chilean indigenous woman doing on the Antarctic shore decades before anyone that we know of for sure even stepped foot on the continent? Now I want to make it clear before I go any further, the indigenous Chilean people are incredibly smart and sophisticated and always have been, but no one thinks or is suggesting an early Chilean indigenous arrival to Antarctica. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. But despite this, there has been put forward a very workable theory of how her skull ended up here, but it is kind of a heartbreaking one. You see, we do have accounts and stories of different sealers and sometimes whalers coming down towards Antarctica around this time period. Not indigenous seal hunters, but European ones. Now, these European sealers, actually some of them did have relations with the different indigenous people in Chile. They would trade with them and sometimes use them as guides for sealing and whale hunting. However, these groups were also famous for frankly treating the indigenous people at times very, very terribly, sometimes conducting slave raids, and especially they were famous for taking women without their consent on board with them, using them, and then dumping them off when they were done. Now, this woman's skull that was found on the beach, Dr. Torres estimates she couldn't have been older than 21 years old. And well, I know I just told you that sometimes the sealers and whalers would use indigenous peoples as guides, and it wasn't always a confrontational or exploitive relationship. I'm really, really struggling to think of a scenario where a 21-year-old indigenous Chilean girl could in any way be thought of as a good guide for a group of European sealers on the coast of Antarctica. And hinting at that, well, after Dr. Torres discovered that first skull, they would later on the same beach discover a few more bones, specifically some femurs. And it's from looking at these bones as a whole that we know what we do now. This is how they were able to piece together both the race of this woman and her age, but also, and again hinting that she may not have been there willingly, the bones showed that this woman had been living under severe nutritional stress and was anemic. She was not doing well at the time of her death, and when she did die, the running theory now with Dr. Torres and basically with the entire scientific community is that this woman died in their care, in these sealers' care, and she was either thrown overboard, or if they somehow made their way to this island, they just tucked her there, until eventually she would be found 175 years later amongst garbage, alone, and forgotten, over 1,000 miles from her home. This story obviously hit me hard, and that is a horrible, horrible fate to imagine any person at any point in human history going through. But I do want to point out that this story also has one more big twist in it. And it's a twist that has almost a smack of divine justice to it. Because let's look at modern Antarctica now. And actually, if you look at this very unique map that I'm showing you here, you'll notice that Antarctica is actually kind of a complicated political place. It's broken up into different sections that different countries have rights over, some of these sections overlapping. And this is all because of international treaties that these different countries and all the countries collectively of the world have agreed to. The first being signed in 1959 and then later being updated in the 1990s. These treaties specifically state that Antarctica is a nature reserve. It can't be exploited for mining, say, or for any resources that might be below the ice. There's one place in the world that we've decided to set apart to be a place of research and study, and to be a place to just let nature in its weird, harsh, frozen glory just do its thing. And specifically, I really want to stress again that underneath this treaty, it is illegal to extract any minerals except for the purpose of scientific research from any part of Antarctica. But this treaty, specifically as it was added to and changed in the 1990s, this treaty was designed to last for 50 years, at which point it could be reassessed and a new treaty could be drawn up. Now, our current treaty that all of us are abiding by for Antarctica ends in 2048. When that happens, there will need to be another world gathering to decide the fate of the frozen continent. And while 2048 may sound far away, we both know it's really not. And that mineral thing, that mineral extraction thing, well, you may have heard about that in regards to other countries in the news recently, like the minerals that Antarctica could hold beneath all that ice could be a huge, huge financial game changer for some lucky country that could justify having some sort of ownership or dominion over the continent. To quote Klaus Dodds, a professor of geopolitics at Royal Holloway University in London, quote, "Lots of people just don't understand that there's a darker side to Antarctica. The reason 2048 looms large is because if certain countries feel that the prohibition on mineral exploitation is no longer to be respected, people worry that the whole thing could unravel. The big players, usually China and Russia, are thinking about this particular episode around 2048 and planning ahead." End quote. This is all kind of terrifying to think about, and I know our world is already filled with kind of terrifying things right now, but my goodness, you guys, the size of this potential, I don't want to say clusterfuck, but I don't know quite what other term to use. It's a problem. Now, mind you, I don't think it's a problem that we have to solve here, but it's something that you and I in our lifetimes are probably going to have to reckon with. Antarctica could very well be the mineral battleground of the future. But what does all this have to do with our Chilean mystery lady? What does this have to do with the Yamana Skull? Well, once again, our friend Professor Dodd has some helpful things to say on the matter. Quote, "When remains or objects are found in the ice, I could see straight away it would inflate territorial nationalism. Archaeology has always been really important for national politics." End quote. And what he's getting at there is that if Chile can say that they have claim to this, if they can somehow prove that they had people there before anyone else, then they could argue that they have rights to it. But I'm not trying to pick on Chile. Professor Dodds in that same interview also points out the investigation of shipwrecks, for example, from other nations that have occurred along the Antarctic coast, and different nations trying to figure out, well, did those people make it ashore? What nation truly had people there first, and can you prove it? These may all sound kind of like fuzzy, unimportant questions to ask, but these are the questions that are going to be used partly to decide the fate of the continent in the future. And so now all these countries are kind of getting together, and there's been more and more archaeological work done down in Antarctica in recent years, specifically, though they don't usually say so, related to this purpose, to try to figure out who has claim to this lost continent. Because whoever can prove that they somehow do, well, they've got a lot of power in their hands. I think it's funny, in a way, because this skull that Dr. Torres found, which he would name the Yamana Skull, I should say, that's where that name comes from the Yamana people of South America. And the beach itself where the skull was found was actually named the same thing, after them and after her. And this skull, the remains of this 200-year-old Chilean woman, are still the oldest human remains found on Antarctica. Which means, and this kind of brings me to that divine justice bit I brought up earlier, because this woman that almost certainly had very little value to the people that she was with, this woman who died tragically young, almost certainly ended up on Antarctica through no choice of her own. Well, now the weight of a continent is resting on her. And pretty soon, the entire world is going to be looking at the skull of this woman, which may be in some ways the most powerful skull in the world. And there's a part of me that kind of enjoys that. But it's also worth noting too that, again, more archaeological research is being done down there all the time. And I started this main body chunk of the episode by telling you about the Polynesian explorers. And there could well be even older remains found eventually on Antarctica. It might not play out the way I just said. But either way, the Yamana Skull and just the significance of it is not something that's going to be forgotten anytime soon. And as for all the geopolitics and the rest of it, I guess that's something we're just going to have to figure out. But what are your thoughts? What do you make of all this? Do you think there could be still older remains yet to be found in Antarctica? What do you make of the different nations trying to find different ways to stake claim on the continent? Do you think that archaeology has any bearing or should have any bearing in this fight? Let me know what you think below. I'm always a little leery of history being politicized. I try really hard to make this not a left-leaning history channel or a right-leaning history channel. I just want it to be a friggin' history channel. But there's some politics that I guess unfortunately we just can't ignore. Actually, on that note, elbows up, my fellow Canadian friends. But I will stop there for today, guys, and thank you again so much for joining me. I'll be honest, when I first started researching that episode, I was really just interested in a mystery skull in Antarctica, because how often do you have an archaeological mystery on Antarctica? But as I got into the depths of it and started to truly understand what this skull symbolized and what archaeology as a whole symbolized on the frozen continent, it did kind of take my breath away a little. Although I hope that her skull doesn't come to represent so much that we forget that it's a symbol of a tragedy, of a young lady's death. That doesn't stop it from being fascinating. And now with it being the subject of so much interest, then hopefully in the future, who knows what new technology could bring. Up next, we're going back to the subterranean realm again. We love our caves here in the Lost Realms. Although this one actually sounds legitimately terrifying, because it's also very legitimately thought to be a portal to the Mayan version of hell. Actually, it's not just one cave, it's a bunch of caves. Because it's time to go to Belize. It's time to go to Xibalba. The modern-day nation of Belize is located in Central America on the northeast coast, though it was known as British Honduras until 1973 and was in fact the last British colony on the American mainland. But it's had human habitation for far, far longer than that. People have lived here in this region for thousands and thousands of years, and Belize is just home also to an amazing selection of natural wildlife and beautiful landscapes. Famous for its crystal clear white sand beaches and its beautiful jungles, it plays host to a stunning variety of plant and animal life, and a lot of it's located in what's known as the Tapir Mountain Nature Reserve, an area of protected land spanning 6,386 acres, and is the natural habitat for just a stunning amount of biological life. So far, over 200 different species of bird, 55 different mammal species, 27 different reptile species, and many others have been discovered in this nature reserve. There have been over 90 different species of butterfly alone found here. The endangered Yucatan black howler monkey also makes its home here, and the Bard's tapir, which I think is actually quite adorable. And this whole nature reserve is characterized by cool mountain streams and thick, dense rainforest, and also a huge amount of caves. This karst landscape has been worn away by water over time, so that there are many underground, even freshwater sinkholes, known as cenotes, that the local indigenous people here have relied on for part of their water source for time immemorial. There are also just many caves that can be explored, but as one does so, one truly begins to enter something of another world. Some of the largest of these caves can truly have their own ecosystems and life forms. Perhaps the most famous of all of Belize's caves is the Acton Tanucio Macnau Cave, or the ATM. Now this name translates to the Cave of the Crystal Sepulchre, or sometimes the Cave of the Stone Sepulchre. This comes from the large calcite deposits that can be found all over the walls in this cave. It's also like many karst caves filled with stalactites and stalagmites, but this calcite buildup all over everything can lend it a sparkly appearance inside this cave. But as one ventures deeper into this system, which extends for a few kilometers, you begin to see some of the less pleasant aspects of the ATM cave. As I said, it extends for quite a ways. Soon you're out of the reach of natural light. Headlamps or flashlights are definitely required. And to get into the deepest, darkest parts of this cave, you have to go through water. A river runs through the ATM cave system, and the average person will have to wade through water up to their neck to be able to proceed. And the darkness of this place is not empty. As I mentioned, there is a rich variety of life that hides in the shadows here. Some quite standard. The water that you're wading through could play home to crabs, crayfish, and catfish. Bats make their way in and out of this cave all the time. But as you go down further and deeper into the darkness, scorpions and predatory spiders also make their homes in the nooks and crannies of this cave system. And so maybe it's understandable that the first humans that we know of, the Maya, to enter this cave thousands of years ago, well, they didn't give it a shiny, sparkly name. To them, this cave and several others like it were viewed as entryways into the realm of the lords of the dead, or more bluntly, as gateways into hell, or their version of it anyway, and it is somewhat of a suitable comparison. This place, known to them as Xibalba, which literally translates to the place of fright, was home to the lords of death, the beings in charge of tormenting the living, both in life and after death. They had names like Flying Scab and Gathered Blood and the Pus Demon and the Jaundice Demon, and they always worked in pairs, always taking sadistic pleasure in the terror that they could wreak on the living. Xibalba was their home. It was where they reigned supreme. It was a dark and horrible place, and the Mayans did believe that these caves, and in particular even this ATM cave, was a way that one could enter it. But certainly no one under normal circumstances would want to. And in fact, for most of Mayan history, while they would make regular visits to this cave, they mainly stayed near the entrance, where the light could still reach them. The deepest, darkest parts of the ATM cave, and others like it, in fact many others like it in Belize, would have been an absolutely terrifying place for the average Mayan person to venture to go. Even maybe more so than for you or me. And yet, here in the ATM cave system, if you were to venture down to the deepest, darkest parts of it right now, you would find the remains of a grisly and elaborate ceremonial human sacrifice, and proof, concrete proof, that for at least one time in their history, the Mayans made a point of coming down here to the most terrifying place they would have known of many times over and over again. And in fact, modern archaeologists have proven that all of the remains of these human sacrifices here in ATM Cave and all of the related caves nearby, they all date to one exact specific moment in Mayan history, at one very dramatic and one very important part in their timeline. And it's at this point that something happened that made the Mayan convinced that they had to go down here to literally their version of the gates of hell repeatedly and enact violent, and at times it seems almost indiscriminate, human sacrifice. But what happened? What made all this come to pass? Now, human sacrifice is a controversial topic at the best of times, but particularly with the Maya. For a really long time, the idea that dominated with historians was that the Mayan were a particularly peaceful people, or at least more so than those around them, and that until relatively late in their history, they didn't practice much by way of human sacrifice. However, more recent archaeological evidence, some very recent, has shown that that's simply not the case. And in fact, at different points in their history, the Mayans certainly did practice different forms of sacrifice. But as I said, normally with the caves that we've been looking at, they weren't going down deep, not like this. And actually, also in recent years, many of these same archaeologists have put together some really good theories as to why things may have changed for them in this way. But we'll get into all that. We'll talk more about what we know of these caves. We'll talk more about the sacrifices in them and what they could mean. And also look at how what we see down in these deepest, darkest corners of ATM Cave are almost like a snapshot of a larger picture in the Mayan societal and sort of cosmological whole. And oh my goodness, I've been waiting to share this story with you guys now for a while. It's been on my mind ever since I made the Lyoba episode a few months ago. And I'm sure if you've seen that one, you can see the similarities here. And I ended up reading about Xibalba then and just being fascinated by it. But because at that time, new research had just come out about Lyoba, I wanted to share that with everyone. So I put this on the back burner until now, and I just can't let it wait anymore. This is so fascinating. It's absolutely terrifying. It has two of my biggest fears. We're going underground again, and thank you, BelizeHub.com, for taking the time to point out there's predatory spiders in this cave. That's just, oh my, this is not a natural environment for a Marie. I was not built for predatory spider fighting. I'm gonna own that. I'm gonna need you guys. We gotta be tough little soldiers in this one. We gotta power through. We gotta be strong. We gotta be strong for the history. We can do it for the history. Are you guys ready? I'm not ready, but I pretend I am. We can do it. We got subterranean spider-filled underworld bits. Oh my goodness. I'm gonna have to call my dad. I think before we go further, it would help for us to sort of refresh ourselves with what we know of the Maya civilization as a whole, especially during the so-called Classic period, which extended roughly from 250 to 950 CE. But the Maya and their ancestors existed in this region far before that. The heartland consisted of what we would today think of as mostly of Belize and Guatemala, but they did spread even further, and their cultural influence lasted long after them. And they certainly didn't all disappear after the year 950 either, but we'll talk about that more a little bit later. For now, though, it's worth noting when they were sort of at their flourishing peak during the Classic period, they were home to some of the biggest cities in the world at that time. And the ATM cave system that we've been talking about is not that far from Karakol, a huge city that may have been home to as many as 180,000 people. Even closer would have been the grand city of Tikal, which itself was home to maybe as many as 100,000 as well. And all across the Mayan heartland, there were many such beautiful, huge cities that were also home too to a wide variety of art and architectural styles. And culture throughout this period was thriving and growing just like the rest of Mayan society. They've built beautiful stone monuments, pyramids, and palaces. They studied astronomy, composed music, and wrote in elegant and mysterious hieroglyphs that we're still working on understanding the depths of today, and is widely believed to have been the most advanced writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas. And if we look at the remains left to us in the ATM cave system and in the other caves that I mentioned to you that they visited, we can see that they didn't just leave us the remains of literal humans, but beautiful ceramics and tools. These were an incredibly sophisticated people. But despite all this, like I said, their flourishing period ended around the year 950. Something happened, and the whole Mayan society underwent what's sometimes called today the Mayan collapse. Now, sometimes people debate and sort of add politics to that term collapse that I'm not really going to bother getting into here. And this is still sort of a mysterious period in history. But basically, throughout the 9th century, the beautiful and sophisticated cities of the Maya began to be abandoned. The great city of Tikal dropped from population during the 9th century from that around 100,000 to 10,000. Kings and rulers fell all throughout the heartland, and in the wake of this century-long decline and collapse, the people of the Maya would never be quite the same. And interestingly, it's from this dramatic period of upheaval and destruction and enigma that these sacrifices start to appear in the deepest, darkest part of ATM Cave, and in all these sacred dark caves of Belize. They begin to go down to the darkest parts, the scariest parts they can, making elaborate ceremonial sacrifices involving men, women, and children. At our ATM cave system alone, now sparkling with calcification, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of at least 14 people, including this one that used to be called the Crystal Maiden, though they now think it's actually the remains of a young man. Some of them are posed or left in unique and sometimes disturbing ways. In dark crevices, the skeletons of infants could be found crammed. And at the base of a massive mineral deposit, they found the dismembered remains of 2 young men, and so on. But as researchers have analyzed these sacrifices at the ATM cave and at others, and looked at them within the wider range of Mayan cosmology, they came up with a theory that what we're looking at here are not just human sacrifices, but elaborately staged spiritual theatrical events. But I mean that in a respectful way. There seems to be elements of these sacrifices that are taken from the Mayan creation story of the Popol Vuh. Now this story features the tale of the hero twins that go down into Xibalba, into the underworld, the hell of the Lords of Death, and face them. They're forced to overcome dangerous and elaborate trials and tests by the Lords of Death, but the hero twins, after many trials, eventually succeed in outsmarting them and defeating them, for the good of both themselves and all humanity, before eventually leaving the underworld and becoming the sun and moon. This was a story that would have inspired hope in Mayan people and would have been told in different versions over and over again. A true story in their mind of good triumphing over evil, a banishment of the forces of death. And once researchers began to realize that these sacrifices that we see in the ATM cave and others are staged to look like parts of the Popol Vuh, and that they were placed here during the period of the Mayan collapse, well, that just made scientists and historians all the more anxious to figure out, well, what was going on during this 100 years? And recent research in these caves, along with looking at different things like tree ring analysis and sediments from lakes, they've realized that from the beginning of the 9th century until the end, and perhaps even longer, rain began to dwindle in this region before stopping altogether. The ancient Maya would have gone through an over centuries-long unprecedented drought, and the Maya already had an extremely complicated relationship with water. Between May to October of every year, this region experiences a wet season where there's a lot of rain normally, but then for the rest of the year, they go through a long dry spell. During this time, the Mayan were forced to rely on water they saved in cisterns from the rainy season and irrigation canals to keep their crops growing, and also those underground freshwater sinkholes, those cenotes. But if the rain stopped for this long, for over a century, those cisterns and natural reservoirs would dry up. The crops would die. Millions of people would die, or be forced to flee to try to find anywhere that was safer, better to live, migrating to the few lakes in the region or to the coast. The cities would have emptied, and it's during this time of desperation and fear, of literally feeling like their world was ending, that they would have turned to the spiritual tales of their people that had sustained them for so long. They would have looked at the stories of their past, of their heroes, and some historians and researchers have put forth the idea that the sacrifices that we're looking at the bottom of ATM Cave and others are the remains of a Mayan collapse period drought cult. On some of the vessels found in these caves, and sometimes on the caves themselves, are images of the rain god Chak, who literally looks like a monster whose mouth is drawn almost like the mouth of a cave. And while these caves, these portals to Xibalba, were certainly places of horror, of death and disease and destruction, they were also a place symbolic of good's true victory over evil. And while in normal circumstances, they would have never been willing to go down here over and over again. But now, at the height of it all, at the height of their collapse, they did what they truly felt they had to do. And they made themselves go through rites and sacrifices and rituals they would have never normally done. Through death and violence and sacrifice, trying to literally will a new rebirth and creation for the Mayan people. But unfortunately, it didn't work. The Mayan society, or at least the so-called classic Mayan period, would end, as I said, around this time. And today, the jungle has worked to reclaim lots of her lost cities, though humans are doing their best lately, especially to try to get some of them back. And we're learning a lot from them, and from caves like ATM. And I think that's why the story of this cave and its sacrifices are just so haunting. They're using death to try to resuscitate life. And when you look at a snapshot of these ancient sacrificial victims, when you look at this photo here, or any of them, you're looking at, in a very real way, condensed the entire creation and destruction of Mayan society. But like I said earlier, it's not as if after the collapse the Maya all just disappeared. Though their cities would never rise again quite the way they had before, they had a very permanent impact on all the other peoples to come into this area after them. And while the Mayan would certainly face horrible challenges again with the arrival of the Spaniards and the Spanish colonization, they're certainly still not gone today. And in Belize, they still make up well over 10% of the modern day total population, many of them still speaking some of the different indigenous Mayan languages, and some even still coming down to caves like ATM to perform rituals and sacrifices, though chicken-based now, to ask for rains when it's that time. These caves remain a huge part of their culture and who they are, in a really real and heartbreaking way, are a testament to their determination to survive through a horrible, horrible time. The fear that they would have felt going down into these deep, dark places to do what would have been unusual and dark even for them, even within their own cultural context, and a backdrop of total societal destruction. It's almost unfathomable to think of. But if you ever find yourself in Belize today, you can get tours, I guess, of some of these caves, including ATM. But would you want to go? What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on Xibalba too? And on some of these names, Flying Scab? Oh my goodness, Flying Scab, that sounds extremely unpleasant. I didn't really dive into too much either the creation story as a whole, but it's fascinating. There'll be a link in my sources. You guys can read a whole translation of the Popol Vuh if you want to, and let me know what you think. Oh my goodness, well that was something else. That those caves seem terrifying. I am still so fascinated by them though, and the sacrifices there and what the Mayan went through. It's hard to not, on one hand, sensationalize the collapse and be like, oh, it was the apocalypse, it was the Mayan apocalypse and all this stuff, to the point that you forget that the Mayan are still a living people and culture, that they still exist. But on the other hand, I don't want to downplay the collapse either, because it does sound like a terrible time to live through, to be honest. A century-long drought, at a time when you don't have outside help to call on at all. It sounds horrible. And up next, we'll see a people that lived during a different time of collapse, but they seem to be thriving and building huge monumental structures as a result. The Caucasus region of Europe, and specifically the Caucasus mountain ranges, are a breathtaking and beautiful place. The Caucasus Mountains themselves are split up between two ranges, the Greater Caucasus and the Lesser Caucasus. The highest peak between the two, Mount Elbas, is 5,642 meters above sea level, and you can see on this map that these two mountain ranges form like a belt between the Black Sea on one side and the Caspian Sea on the other. And because of these factors, the mountains and the seas, and also just because of where this region is located in the world, the Caucasus as a whole being split up between four nations today, Russia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, this area plays host to a wide variety of different sort of little ecosystems and subclimates, ranging from desert to subtropical. And humanity too has a diverse and extremely long history here. In Azerbaijan, there's petroglyphs dating back to at least 10,000 years ago. And in Georgia, where we're actually going to be spending most of our time here today, there's evidence of winemaking back from 8,000 years ago. And Georgia is believed to be the spot of the world's oldest cultivation of grapes for wine. Now, Georgia's place in the Caucasus region has a little bit of the greater and a little bit of the lesser Caucasus mountain ranges within it. And within the southern Caucasus, just like throughout the rest of this area, there is a huge, long history of human habitation. And just recently, actually very recently, in January of 2025 of this year, a group of researchers published a study on some unique and exciting findings that they made in Georgia in the southern Caucasus region that is expanding our knowledge and our view even further of how people have lived here over the course of thousands of years, and also helping shape our view about one of history's sort of most famous episodes, and that is the Bronze Age collapse. Jumping back a few years now to 2018, a group from Cranfield University, led by Dr. Nathaniel Erb Sutulo, began researching evidence here that they'd found in the southern Caucasus in Georgia of a late Bronze Age fortress, initially thought to be somewhat small in size. But it was situated here, on a beautiful, very dramatic plateau, literally perched between two gorges. Now this clearly would have been a very high visibility and strategic place for anyone to build any kind of defensive structure. But as they began working here in 2018, just doing initial surveying, no real excavations at this point yet, and began utilizing some groundbreaking technology to allow them to observe the site in closer detail without disturbing it. Well, let's just say they went from thinking it was a small fortress to, well, literally, as you already saw, I'm going to show you it one more time, being comfortable using terms like mega fortress. And honestly, that term is both super appropriate, as you'll see here, and also just extremely delightful. But we'll get into all that. We'll get into why people are calling it something like this and what we know of it so far. And also, too, how they use some really, really cool and unique ways to sort of somewhat verify their findings. But first, may I say, before I get too far ahead of myself and excited here, hello, welcome, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Lost Bits, the place where we talk about unusual, mysterious parts from our past together. I'm your host, I'm Marie, and it's lovely to see you again. And I'm so excited to share a little bit of the story with you of Dmanisis Gora, the mega fortress from an age of apocalypse. And actually, if some of these pictures that I showed you a little bit here are looking somewhat familiar, that may be because I did cover it a little bit here on a short on my channel, but it's just so fascinating that I had to do a little bit more digging and share now what I found with you guys. Now, I will be honest, this will be a bit of a shorter episode here because this is news that just broke as I'm recording this. Oh my gosh, two and a half months ago. They've done no formal excavation work here whatsoever. But it's amazing what they have been able to figure out without being able to do any of that yet. And this is such a fascinating place, you guys. I know we're going to be hearing more about it in the future. And this place does. It sounds totally badass. We're going to go into some details here, but this place was, oh my goodness, it was defensive to the extreme. It was built up, buffed up to the extreme. Even kind of by the heavy duty sort of standards of the ancient world, you know. And I love this picture. I showed you guys it a second ago, and I can't get over it. It's such a beautiful place. Oh my goodness, I wish we could go there. Okay, we're ready. I'm so excited. We're going to go to the nation of Georgia. We're going to go to the mountains. We're going to go see some mountainous Georgian ancient military bits. Oh, these sound so tough and cool. Now, they have found other fortresses like this dating to around the same period, and this period, I should say more specifically, is roughly from 1500 to 500 BCE. And our fortress here, which was given the name Dmanisis Gora, was initially thought to just be this sort of smaller hunk here, right at the corner, at the edge of these two gorges here. Again, very dramatic, very flash, but now what they've been doing, and this is very, very cool, they used aerial photography and drone mapping to conduct a wide-scale aerial survey of this place, literally taking almost 11,000 high-resolution images. And not only that, but because, so in the introduction I mentioned to you that people have been living in this area for a very, very long time. And even today, it's a very culturally diverse area. The whole Caucasus region is. And this area of the southern Caucasus, oh my goodness, even just by the time of our time period, by the time of Dmanisis Gora, there have been so many cultures. For example, the Trialeti people that were amazing at metalworking and left us really ornate and rich tombs and remains of their structures behind. And even beyond them and before them, this whole area, just by virtue of where it is, it's acted for a long time as sort of a crossroads between the peoples of Europe and Asia and the Middle East, and would become a famous region mentioned by some of the most famous players from history. The ancient Greeks knew this place, this whole region, as the Colchis, and it featured heavily in the story of Jason and the Argonauts going to get their golden fleece. So seeing advanced building here like we do at the site of our fort shouldn't surprise us even from this early date. But what was surprising when they were finished this aerial mapping of the site was just how much larger this place was than they initially thought, because it was so much astoundingly bigger than they ever dreamed. Yeah, that 40 times up there, that's not an exaggeration. Like, this is just incredible. Like, you see the long wall here that looks like up and down to us. This itself is over 1 kilometer long. And you can see from that point inward until the major fortress heart, which is the area that they'd first identified there were many different other buildings and structures and fortifications. But before they did any further investigating or speculating or whatever, they wanted to make sure that what they were identifying in these photographs were actually what they appeared to be. Or at least they wanted more evidence in that direction so they could try to, get this study out and eventually get clearance to physically excavate up here. Now, because of the elevation of this spot, and just the history of this area, they do know that people have been doing agriculture work up here in recent years. What they really needed was some sort of way to check photographs of the area before the worst of the agriculture damage had started in more modern times. They basically need photographs, aerial photographs from the past of this spot, which is obviously kind of incredibly hard to do. But thankfully they did actually get an odd boost in that department. And in 2013, the Russian government declassified a bunch of old Cold War era Soviet spy satellite photos. Some of these were taken actually over, just by coincidence, the area of Dmanisis Gora. So they were able to actually get what they needed of these, basically the perfect snapshot in time, because this would have been right before the Soviet control in the area really boosted up agriculture production in this spot. So they were able to compare their new aerial photographs through the drones versus these Cold War era spy satellite photos to really get a better idea of what they were seeing. So this final photograph here that I keep showing you, with the speculative layout over and of the buildings, they do feel now is actually really accurate. And they've found other ruined settlements too in this area, like I mentioned to you before. And they've done some excavation at some of those, and part of the layout too is coming from them looking at the layout of these other ruined settlements nearby from this same time period. Mind you, I say all that, there's still so many gaps we have here. We need to get in there and excavate. But I do want to focus in on this inner fortress core again for a second, because I think it will highlight just how amazing and incredible and how defensively powerful a site that this was. Now, just this inner fortress core alone, which spans about 1.5 hectares, consists of 2 very substantial fortification walls, with a third smaller wall running parallel between them. Now, this smaller middle wall doesn't seem to have been near as big as the 2 walls on either side of it. It probably wasn't a major added defensive barrier, more kind of like a slow down barrier, as it were. Now, around the same time they were doing all this drone photography, they did do a little low-level surface excavation, and the majority of the living detritus that they found came from this inner fortress core, within the innermost sets of walls, where they found evidence of continuous habitation dating from the late 2nd to 1st millennium BCE. There's clear evidence of buildings being built into the interior sections of the walls. And I do want to say that from what they've been able to gather, it seems like people were probably living in this inner fortress area year-round for a while. But that's not necessarily true as we expand outwards towards the rest of Dmanisis Gora as a whole. They have found evidence of plowing and some burial mounds that still need to be excavated, but there's no huge amount of living debris or anything like that comparable to the level that they see at that inner fortress, leading the researchers that are studying this place to wonder, well, if maybe only some people were stationed here or living here year-round, and the rest were sort of just coming and going at different times. But what's interesting to note is that the large outermost wall that we looked at a little bit ago, that runs up to down here mostly in this picture, this seems to have been built around the same time as the inner fortress. So they were setting aside this big swath of area. And it's leading researchers to sort of speculate, well, why? Like, they know there's lots of semi-nomadic pastoral behavior in this region at this point, but why set aside all this land and build this huge big fortress? And it's a huge amount of land that was not really fully used, or it doesn't seem like it so far. And again, this is all a little bit of speculation, but they were talking about it in their study here, in this recent study that we've been discussing. Because the researchers have been looking at the different archaeological remains they've been able to recover, like ceramic fragments and charcoal and things like that, and been doing radiocarbon dating on the few things that they have, as well as analyzing these photographs. And they do feel fairly confident that all of these structures, or at least the big defensive elements of the walls throughout the settlement, throughout Dmanisis Gora, were built around the same time. Now, was this something a bunch of semi-nomadic but culturally joined people agreed to and all contributed to, so that this was some place they could all agree to come back to as a safe spot? Or, and they thought of this too in their study, is this kind of like a failed urban experiment? Not to be harsh on them using the word failed, but were they maybe hoping for this to become sort of more than just a fortress, to eventually morph into a permanent city, and that just for whatever reason didn't happen? Which brings us to sort of a very interesting backdrop to all this, because this is all happening, and this settlement, Dmanisis Gora, and the other contemporary settlements are all kind of building up and flourishing and growing during a period known today as the Late Bronze Age. And this is kind of fascinating in itself, because the Late Bronze Age is a time when a lot of contemporary societies, to those living in Dmanisis Gora, were apparently collapsing. The Late Bronze Age collapse is now a kind of famous, well, what's thought of almost as a cascading systems failure of a bunch of different Mediterranean cultures and societies around this time. Many different cities and city-states and kingdoms seem to collapse in a relatively short period of time. Perhaps the most famous civilizational losses from this time are the Hittites and the Mycenaean civilization. But there were many different people groups that suffered throughout this time, and there's been many different causes put forward as to what could have been responsible for all this. And honestly, it was probably a combination of factors. There seemed to have been a somewhat warlike group, the famous Sea Peoples, that was wreaking havoc on the Mediterranean. But their very existence and some of the ongoing stresses on this region too could have been tied to the fact that there were climatic changes going on and different instabilities going on already in some of these different nations. But regardless of the exact factors at play, which are still a matter of great debate for a lot of people, what we do know is that the neighbors of Dmanisis Gora, or at least a lot of them, would have been kind of declining or vanishing even possibly at this time. And meanwhile, here was this huge, literally mega fortress kind of flourishing. Now, why was that? And do the defensive structures, the huge amount of walls and fortifications we see at Dmanisis Gora, are they a reflection in some way of the kind of fraught political and environmental landscape of the people at this point? These are all kind of important questions, and like I hinted at in the intro, kind of challenging our view of the Bronze Age collapse. There's already been some scholars say that the Bronze Age collapse may have been even more complicated and multifaceted than we initially thought. And sites like Dmanisis Gora seem to lead to that. Here's a spot really not that far away from some others that have been facing extreme challenges at this point, and here's this place flourishing. This huge, massive place that would have been such a statement, like on this beautiful plateau up here like this, and sort of positioned to be the first thing you see, and then all the other buildings there kind of tucked away behind like that, you know? It's so dramatic and beautiful, and yet it was never completely full either, or at least what we know, okay? And that's the other thing. We still have so much here to figure out still. Like, you'll notice I haven't said concretely the name of the people who built this fort. We're not really sure. I haven't said why it was eventually abandoned. Again, not really sure about that. We don't really know. This is all just such a new discovery that we have so much to figure out. Like I said, there hasn't been really any large-scale proper excavations yet here at all. So I am going to have to probably stop there for today, guys. I will let you know when anything else cool comes out about it, and let me know your thoughts on all this below. Do you think that we're seeing a mega fortress in response to the challenges of the Bronze Age collapse? Or do you think that this is totally unrelated to all that, and maybe the collapse and whatever causes were behind it just, didn't make it across those mountains, or just didn't make it this far? And we haven't even talked about yet, well, maybe they're participating in the Bronze Age collapse. Maybe this was a haven for the sea peoples, or they were in some other way profiting off of what was going on. Let me know your thoughts down below. I'm interested. Yeah, that fortress, like I said, we don't know so much yet, but I'm so fascinated by it. Can you just imagine the spectacle it would have been to like come across the plain and look up and at the top of this hill by these gorges just see this giant mega fortress? It would have just been it would have just been spectacular. It would have been amazing. And it's such a new discovery. We're bound to get more news out of there soon. But that's going to do it for me here today, guys. And thank you so much for being here for only the second ever Lost Bits Mega-Pak. I had so much fun putting these together and recording the news stories and everything else. I was initially, when I did these, going to make the news stories eventually available as singles on the channel, but I really want to do something special for the people that stick around and wait for these longer compilations. So they are. I'm flip-flopping from now on. All the special episodes for the Mega-Pak will just stay with the Mega-Pak as my way of saying thank you to you guys that do wait around for these long ones. And I was thinking in the future maybe doing Mega-Paks like this of totally new stories, maybe like even themed ones. I'm not sure if that's something you guys would be interested in, so please let me know down in the comments if you would, or anything else you'd like to hear about. And I just love to hear from you in general, so be sure to pop down below. And if you find yourself particularly interested in any of the topics we covered in our story today, then guys, please don't let my words be the last words you hear on any of them. Just like always, you'll find a full source list, or rather a bunch of source lists, pinned to the top comment below, but please don't stop there. And may I say your local library could have an awesome book on any of the awesome cultures that we covered here today. You might find something on Neanderthals, you might find something on the Sahara, you might, I don't even know, you'll find something awesome. I have been a proponent of this for a very long time. I have said this before, I just go right into the library and I let the mood take me. I let the book mood take me, you know. Maybe you won't find a book on the Neanderthals, but you might find a cool book on chimpanzees. You might not find a cool book on the Sahara, but you could find a weird book on the Swiss Alps, you know. It's a library. It's a hodgepodge of knowledge awesomeness. Just get down there. You'll have such a fun time. You'll have such a good time. And then when you get back from the library, let me know how you made out. And also, once you're back, if you enjoyed what you saw here today, then be sure to check out the rest of my channel where I post new videos every week. So hopefully you'll find something there that you like, and I'll get to see you again soon. But either way, thank you again so much for being here today. Be safe, be happy, go with all my love. Until next time, goodbye.